At midnight on a road that the city had long forgotten, a black woman hit her brakes for no reason she could name. Not for the smoke. Not for the glass scattered across the asphalt like broken teeth. She hit the brakes because something in her chest, something older than logic and quieter than fear, told her that if she didn't stop right now, she would spend the rest of her life hearing a sound she never stayed long enough to hear. She didn't stop. Not yet. She sat there, engine idling, hands on the wheel, watching a luxury sedan spin its wheels toward the sky like it was trying to claw its way back to God. And she thought about every case file she had ever closed, every child she had handed off to a system that swallowed them whole, every door she had knocked on that opened just long enough to show her something broken before slamming shut again. She thought, "Keep driving, Alyssa. This is not your case." And then she heard the voice say, "Save her first. Before we get into the story, drop a comment right now and tell me how much you've been enjoying our stories and tell us some improvements you'd like for us to make. Because this story is about what ordinary people do in the dark when nobody is watching, and I want to know where you are when you decide to keep watching. Like this video, if you've ever driven past something you wished you hadn't. Subscribe if you believe that the most dangerous person in any room is not the one with the gun. It's the one with nothing left to lose. The city had a sound at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. Not the glamorous version of City at Night that people described in songs, not jazz bleeding from a cracked window, not the romantic percussion of rain on cobblestone. This was the other sound, the real one, the sound of a bus hydraulics gasping at an empty stop, a trash can rolling across an intersection nobody was watching. A phone ringing inside an apartment where nobody was going to pick up, because everybody in that apartment already knew what the call was about, and knowing was easier than hearing it said out loud. Alyssa Bittens knew that sound the way she knew her own heartbeat. Functional, unremarkable, proof of nothing except that the machinery was still running. She was 44 years old and she drove home the same way every night, not because it was the fastest route, but because it was the route that passed the fewest lit windows, which meant the fewest silhouettes of people living the kind of life that had enough weight to cast a shadow. Alyssa had learned, somewhere in her second decade of social work, that other people's ordinary happiness had a specific texture of pain when you pressed against it the wrong way. So she didn't press. She took the long way. She drove past the warehouses and the closed laundromats and the bus shelters with their flickering advertisements for things that cost more than she made in a month, and she let the quiet be what it was. Her Civic had 190,000 miles on it and a heater that worked only when it felt like it. The passenger seat held a stack of folders thick enough to be its own argument against the idea that the system was functioning. Each folder was a name. Each name was a situation. Each situation was a human being that the city had processed through its machinery and spat out somewhere between complicated and unresolvable, and handed to Alyssa with the unspoken understanding that she would absorb whatever couldn't be fixed. She was good at absorbing. She was less good at remembering to eat before 9 p.m., at returning calls from people who weren't in crisis, at keeping plants alive, at sleeping past 5 in the morning, at the specific social performance of explaining to people at dinner parties. Not that she attended dinner parties. What she did for a living without watching their faces do the thing where they nodded and immediately changed the subject. What Alyssa Bittens did for a living was this. She drove to places where something had already gone wrong, and she tried to slow the wrongness down. 20 years of that. 20 years of arriving after the damage never before. 20 years of being the last resource, the final call, the option people reached for when they had run out of better options. It left a particular kind of mark. Not bitterness. She had met bitter social workers, and she recognized the difference. What it left was something closer to stillness. A radical, almost unnatural stillness. The kind that comes not from peace, but from having processed so much turbulence that your nervous system has quietly renegotiated its relationship with alarm. When other people panicked, Alyssa went quiet. When rooms got loud, she got slower. She had learned to make her voice do something specific, low-level, unhurried, that could reach a person in crisis the way nothing else could. A supervisor had told her once, years ago, that she had a gift for de-escalation. Alyssa had thanked her and gone back to her desk and thought about how gift was a strange word for something born entirely from necessity. She stopped at the 24-hour gas station on Ferris because she needed coffee and because the man who worked the overnight shift, a quiet Eritrean man named Tould, always had the television on with the sound off, which meant Alyssa could stand at the counter for 3 minutes and watch the closed captions scroll without having to perform being okay. Tonight the television was showing something about a wildfire 2 states over. Orange sky, aerial footage, the kind of image that looked almost beautiful until you remembered what it meant. Tould slid the coffee across without her asking. Same as always. Medium, black, no sugar, sleeve already on because the cup ran hot. He didn't say anything and she didn't say anything, and this was, if she was being precise about it, the most intimate exchange she would have today. She left exact change on the counter. Outside, the parking lot's single functional streetlight buzzed and flickered in that way streetlights did around Alyssa. She had noticed it years ago, the phenomenon, if you could call it that. Lights that stuttered when she passed. Not all of them. Not dramatically. Just enough that she had begun to feel in her more exhausted moments that even the city's infrastructure found her presence ambiguous. That even the light wasn't entirely sure she was worth the effort of staying on for. She knew this was not a rational observation. She was tired. Tired people found patterns in things that were simply malfunctioning. She got back in the Civic. She set the coffee in the cup holder. She pulled out of the lot. The glove compartment had a crack that ran diagonally across the front panel, and inside it, underneath her registration and a dried-out pen and a take-out menu from a Thai place that had closed 2 years ago, was the Bible. She did not remember the last time she had opened it. She remembered the last time she had held it, which was different. Holding it was something she did when the specific weight of a specific kind of day required something in her hands that wasn't a steering wheel or a case file. Her mother had carried it first, carried it the way some women carry a practical tool, not for ceremony but for utility. The margins were filled with her mother's handwriting, in a mix of English and Creole, sometimes mid-sentence, thoughts that had continued from one verse to the next, as if the Bible had merely been the nearest available surface for something that needed to get out of her head. One line, near the back, had been underlined 3 times and then circled. The one who tends the wound does not ask whose blood it is. Her mother had not been a soft woman. She had been a woman who understood, without needing to articulate it, that the world was organized around a principle of selective mercy, that some people received it automatically, and others had to construct it from scratch daily, with whatever materials were available. She had constructed it with her hands and her voice, and apparently the margins of a Bible that now lived in a cracked glove compartment in a car that was held together largely by routine. Alyssa kept the Bible there because throwing it away was not a thing she was capable of doing. She kept it there because on the days when she sat in parking lots and hospital waiting rooms and the driveways of houses she had just delivered devastating news to, she needed to know it was close without needing to open it. The way you keep a phone charged even on the days you don't expect anyone to call. She was 4 minutes from home when she saw him. The bus stop at the corner of Delmore and 9th had no bus coming. She knew the routes. She had driven past this stop for 3 years, and the last bus on this line ran at 10:45. It was nearly midnight. There was no reason for a person to be standing at that bus stop. And yet, a man standing, not sitting on the bench, not checking a phone, not doing any of the ambient performance of waiting, just standing, facing the street, facing with a specificity that registered somewhere below her conscious thought the direction her car was coming from, watching. She noted him the way she noted everything, without alarm, without lingering, a data point, a thing that was there. But her eyes, against her will, went to his hands. 20 years of home visits had wired something in her that assessed hands before faces. His were still, inside the pockets of a coat that was too good for this neighborhood and too dark to read. He was not cold. People who are cold move. He was not waiting. People who are waiting look at their phone or at the street or at the time. He was doing something else with his stillness. He was watching. She drove past. She did not brake. She did not look in the rearview mirror, Because looking in the rearview mirror was the thing you did when you wanted to confirm that something was wrong, and confirming it meant carrying it, and Alyssa Bittens had a personal policy about what she carried home. But her hands were tighter on the wheel than they had been 30 seconds ago. And the streetlight above the bus stop, she noticed this later, turning it over in her mind before sleep. The streetlight above the bus stop was working perfectly, clear and steady and bright, illuminating him the way streetlights in this city almost never illuminated her. As if he was the kind of presence the light recognized. As if he was someone the city knew was coming. They say this city chews through its workers and never notices the taste. Alyssa Bittens had been in this city's teeth for 20 years, and it still hadn't swallowed her. What the city didn't understand, what the man at the bus stop didn't understand, what none of them would understand until it was far too late, was that a woman who has learned to survive invisibility doesn't disappear when you look at her. She sharpens. She almost didn't take Route 9 home. There was no logical reason to. Route 9 added 11 minutes to her commute and ran through a stretch of highway the city maintained with the specific neglect it reserved for infrastructure nobody powerful used, cracked median, signage that had been faded since before Alyssa started this job, streetlights spaced so far apart that the darkness between them felt intentional, like the city was making a point. But something had unsettled her on the drive from the gas station, the man at the bus stop, his stillness, the quality of the light around him. And when you've worked 20 years in the margins of human disaster, you learn not to argue with the part of yourself that takes the long way. That instinct had saved her twice before, not dramatically, not in any way she could explain to a supervisor. Just the low-grade animal certainty that something was about to happen in a particular direction, and that she did not want to be in that direction. So she took Route 9, which was, as it turned out, exactly the direction. She heard it before she saw it. A sound, and this is the part that would stay with her, the part her body would catalog and return to at odd hours for months afterward. A sound that arrived in two parts. The first was sharp and percussive, a crack that split the night air clean, the kind of sound that made the ancient, pre-rational part of your brain send a single signal before your conscious mind could form a question. The second was the long, grinding scream of metal finding asphalt, of physics insisting on having its way with something that had been moving too fast in a direction it had no business moving. Her foot was on the brake before she had decided to brake. The luxury sedan was 20 yards ahead, on its roof, wheels still spinning with a kind of bewildered momentum, as if the car itself hadn't caught up with what had happened. Glass scattered across both lanes, catching her headlights and throwing them back at her in 1,000 small directions. Smoke was coming from somewhere under the chassis, not dramatic, not yet on fire, but the smoke of systems under pressure failing quietly. Steam, something fluid on the asphalt catching light and spreading. Alyssa sat with her foot on the brake, and her hands on the wheel and her engine running. She looked at the car. She looked at the road ahead of it, at the skid marks that told a story she could not finish reading in the dark. Too long, too deliberate. The kind of skid marks that come not from a driver who loses control, but from a driver who sees something and decides that a skid is the only remaining option. You learn to read these things. 20 years of arriving after the damage teaches you to reconstruct the moment from the evidence it leaves behind. She looked in her rearview mirror, empty road. She looked to the left shoulder, a stand of scrubby trees, dark, offering nothing. She looked at the car again, and this time she saw movement. A hand, on the asphalt outside the driver's window, fingers pressing flat against the ground as if testing whether it was real. She didn't get out, not yet, because here was what 20 years and every instinct she owned were saying simultaneously, in a voice that was calm precisely because it understood the stakes clearly. The skid marks are wrong. This car did not crash by accident, which means whatever caused the crash may still be on this road, which means the smart thing, the rational, professional, self-preserving thing, is to call 911 from inside a locked car and keep your headlights on and wait. She reached for her phone. She dialed the first digit. And then Sun Disung said, "Save her first." He said it in English, broken, wet, dragged up from somewhere beneath blood and consciousness, and what sounded like a lung that was not working the way it was supposed to. But English. Clear enough. Directed, and this was what moved her. This was the specific mechanism by which 4 words defeated 20 years of carefully constructed self-preservation. Directed not at the road, not at the empty night, not into the general hope that someone somewhere might hear. Directed at her headlights. He knew she was there. He had seen her stop, and with whatever he had left, he had used it not to ask for himself but to ask for her. Save her first. Alyssa put the phone in her jacket pocket. She turned on her hazards. She got out of the car. The air smelled like burnt rubber and something sweet beneath it that she chose not to identify. The asphalt was still warm from the day, and the way asphalt stayed warm long after the sun left. Holding heat the way neglected things held onto the last good thing that had touched them. She moved toward the car in the focused, unhurried way she moved toward every crisis, not slow, but deliberate, because panic in the person arriving is the one thing guaranteed to make everything worse. She crouched at the driver's window. Sun Disung was not what she had expected, and she was already reconstructing what she had expected to construct something more accurate. She knew the name. Vaguely, the way you know names that move through a city's whisper economy, not from news reports. Not from anything official, but from the way certain names attached themselves to certain silences in certain rooms when certain people entered them. Sun Disung. The Sun Syndicate. She had heard it once from a teenager she was trying to pull out of a recruitment pipeline, heard it the way you hear the name of a weather system, something large, something with its own logic, something that didn't particularly care whether you understood it. What she had not expected was his face. Not the blood. She had seen blood. She had pressed her hands into wounds before. Blood was data. Not the tattoos, and there were tattoos, covering his neck, his jaw, the backs of both hands, intricate and dense and running together in the low light so that they seemed to shift when she looked directly at them, seemed to move with the shallow expansion of his chest. She had seen tattoos used as armor, as declaration, as the skin's way of announcing what the mouth had decided to stop saying. What she had not expected was his eyes, open, tracking, fully present in a way that his body, given what she could assess of his injuries, had no business supporting. He was looking at her with the concentrated, undecorated urgency of a man who had reduced himself to a single coordinate, not his pain, not his empire, not whatever had put this car on its roof on a road nobody used. Just his daughter. Just the passenger seat, and what was in it, and whether this woman with her headlights and her hazards and her denim jacket was going to help. She held his gaze for exactly as long as it took to communicate. I hear you. Then she moved to the passenger side. JWA Sanghi was 17 years old and unconscious and bleeding from her hairline in the precise way that head wounds bled, extravagantly, terrifyingly, in a way that looked unsurvivable but often was. Alyssa had seen enough head wounds to know that the blood was not the primary information. The breathing was the primary information, and Sanghi was breathing, shallowly but rhythmically, with the stubborn biological insistence of a young body that had not yet decided to give up. Alyssa took off her outer shirt, the flannel she kept in the backseat for cold offices, and pressed it against the wound with one hand and used the other to check the girl's neck, her collarbone, the position of her spine relative to the door frame. The window was gone. The door was buckled but not fully collapsed. She was not trapped. She was, in the precise language of assessment, accessible. Alyssa got lower. She put her mouth near the girl's ear. I'm here, she said, same voice. Same low, unhurried register she had used in 100 rooms that smelled like different kinds of despair. My name is Alyssa. I've got you. You don't have to do anything. I've got you. Sanghi's hand moved. Not toward Alyssa. Not reflexively, not randomly. It moved with a deliberateness that stopped Alyssa's breath for a moment, a purposeful, conscious tightening of the fingers around something she was already holding. Something she had been holding, Alyssa understood with a cold clarity that moved up her spine before the crash. Something she had made sure to hold on to. Alyssa looked at the girl's hand. Closed, tight, the knuckles pale from the pressure of it. She did not try to open it, not then. She called 911 with the phone against her ear and her hands still working, still pressing, still holding the line between the girl's present state and the next one. She gave the location with the precision of someone accustomed to being the person dispatch relied on to be precise. She gave the condition, 2 occupants, one conscious and critical, one unconscious, stable breathing, head laceration, possible internal injury, with the flatness of someone for whom panic was not a language she spoke in emergencies. She did not mention the tattoos. She did not mention the name. She did not mention the skid marks. She was not ready to explain what she suspected about the skid marks. Di-sung's voice reached her from the other side of the car, weaker now, slower, but still directed, still purposeful. She is the pause of a man prioritizing oxygen. She is not safe. At hospital, do not another pause longer. Do not let them know her name. Alyssa kept her hands on the wound. She kept her voice even. I hear you, she said. You will stay. 20 years of policy and protocol and mandatory reporting requirements and professional boundaries, and the very explicit guidance that social workers do not insert themselves into situations involving organized crime assembled themselves in her mind with the orderly efficiency of a filing system she had spent 2 decades building. She looked at the girl's closed fist. She thought about the skid marks. She thought about the man at the bus stop and his coat and the quality of his stillness, and the fact that she had taken Route 9 tonight without being able to explain why. I'll stay, Alyssa said. Sun Di-sung made a sound that was not quite a word. Then he was quiet. The monitors of the city's machinery, sirens, now faint but growing, the sound of the world catching up to what had already happened, began to assemble themselves in the distance. Alyssa looked at Sang-hee's hand. What is she holding? A father asks a stranger to save his daughter and uses his last waking breath to warn her. A woman who has spent 20 years arriving after the damage makes a choice that has nothing to do with policy. And a girl holds something in a closed fist so tightly that even unconsciousness hasn't loosened her grip. In this city, you're either the wolf or the ghost, but sometimes the most dangerous thing on the road is neither. Sometimes it's the woman who stopped. Mercy General's emergency wing at 1 a.m. had its own particular atmosphere, not chaos, not calm, but the specific suspended quality of a place that had normalized the worst moments of other people's lives to the point where normalcy itself had become the emergency. Fluorescent lights that hummed at a frequency just below conscious irritation. Linoleum floors buffed to a shine that reflected everything and revealed nothing. The intercom paging doctors in a voice so flat it could have been announcing departures at a bus terminal. Alyssa knew this room, not this specific hospital. She worked primarily on the city's west side, and Mercy General sat east, outside her usual geography, but this room in its essential nature. She had spent accumulated months of her professional life in waiting areas exactly like this one, with the same plastic chairs bolted to the same industrial carpet, the same television mounted too high on the wall running the same cable news cycle with the sound on low. The same particular silence of people waiting for news they were not ready to receive. She had always been the professional in those rooms, the one with the lanyard and the folder and the calm, practiced answers. The one the staff nodded to because they recognized what she was, which meant they knew what she was there to do. Tonight she was just a woman in a bloody flannel shirt, sitting in a plastic chair with no folder and no lanyard, and no clear explanation for why she was there that wouldn't raise questions she wasn't prepared to answer. She had given a name at the desk, not Sang-hee's real name. She had used her mother's first name, borrowed it without ceremony, the way you reach for something close when you need something fast. She had described herself as a family friend and held eye contact with the intake nurse long enough to communicate that the paperwork could wait and the girl could not. The nurse, experienced, efficient, unbothered by the blood on Alyssa's shirt in the way ER nurses were professionally unbothered by things that would unravel civilians, had taken the information and moved without asking the follow-up questions that Alyssa was most afraid of. Di-sung had been wheeled in behind them. He had not regained consciousness in the ambulance. The paramedics had worked on him with the focused economy of people doing a job they were good at, and Alyssa had sat across from the gurney and watched his chest and thought about skid marks. She had been in the chair for 40 minutes when she noticed the phone. It was mounted on the wall behind the nurse's station, not the standard desk phone, not the intercom handset, but a separate unit, older with a cord. Red. The kind of phone that existed in hospitals for purposes that were not explained on any public signage. She had seen them before and never thought about them. Infrastructure. Background detail. But the nurse using it now was not behaving like a person making a routine call. She was young, early 30s, short natural hair, the kind of composed efficiency that read as either exceptional professionalism or exceptional training in looking composed. She had her back partially turned to the waiting area, which in itself meant nothing. People turned their backs for privacy, but her left hand was flat against the wall beside the phone, and her head was inclined at an angle that Alyssa, who had spent 2 decades reading the body language of people in the middle of difficult conversations, recognized as the posture of someone listening more intently than they were speaking. And once, just once briefly, she glanced at the waiting area. Not at the room in general, not at the television or the vending machines or the automatic doors, at the specific plastic chair where Alyssa was sitting. Then she turned back to the phone. Alyssa did not move. She did not change her posture. She had learned long ago that the most dangerous thing you could do when you suspected you were being watched was to behave like someone who suspected they were being watched. She looked at the television. She let her hands rest on her knees. She breathed at a rate that suggested a woman waiting, worried, unremarkable. Inside, she was reconstructing everything from the beginning. The skid marks had been too long and too precise for a driver who had simply lost control. Disung's warning, "She is not safe at hospital, do not let them know her name," had not been the warning of a man delirious from injury. It had been specific, operational, the warning of a man who already knew the landscape of what would happen next and was using his remaining consciousness to navigate it. The man at the bus stop, the coat that was too good for the neighborhood, the stillness that was not waiting. And now a nurse on a red phone, looking at Alyssa's chair. The picture was assembling itself with the quiet, cold efficiency of a case file she hadn't asked to open. Someone had caused that crash. Someone had known the route. Someone, which meant multiple someones working in concert, had infrastructure in place, infrastructure that included, potentially, a presence inside this hospital. And Alyssa had driven to the scene, had given her name at the intake desk, had sat for 40 minutes in a lit waiting room making herself, for the first time in 20 years of practiced invisibility, completely visible. The problem with saving someone, she thought, is that you inherit their danger. The cameras went dark at 1:47 a.m. She noticed because she had been watching them. Not obviously, she had been watching them the way she watched everything she was worried about, obliquely, in her peripheral vision, in the reflective surfaces of the room. There were 4 visible cameras in the ER waiting area, standard placement. She had noted them within 10 minutes of sitting down, the way she noted all exits and all recording infrastructure in every room she entered. A habit she had developed not from paranoia, but from 20 years of situations where documentation had been the only protection available. At 1:47 a.m., the small red indicator lights on all 4 cameras went out simultaneously. Not sequentially, not one by one the way cameras failed when a system glitched or a circuit tripped. All 4, one moment, as if someone had pressed a single switch. Alyssa looked at the nurse's station. The nurse with the short hair was gone. The red phone sat in its cradle. Alyssa counted her breaths. 1, 2, 3. She assessed the room, 6 other people in the waiting area, none paying attention to anything except their own private emergencies. 2 nurses at the desk, both occupied. The automatic doors closed. The hallway leading to the treatment rooms to her left, long and bright and currently empty. She picked up her phone and opened her messages and typed nothing, just looked at the screen, because looking at a screen was the universal posture of a person who was simply waiting and had run out of anything else to do with their hands. She did not look at the hallway. She listened to it. The man in the gray suit came from the direction of the elevators, not the treatment wing. This registered. The elevators were for people going to rooms, to floors, to patients already admitted. Nobody came from the elevators into the ER waiting area unless they had already been somewhere else in the building first. He was not rushing. Rushing was for people who needed things urgently. He moved with the particular leisure of someone who had already arranged the room to his specifications and was arriving to observe the results. The suit was charcoal, well-fitted, not expensive in a way that announced itself, but expensive in the way that quality was expensive, in the tailoring, in the way it held its shape despite whatever he'd been doing before he put it on. He was somewhere in his 50s, gray at the temples, a face that had been handsome and had since become something more durable than handsome. He carried nothing. No phone visible, no briefcase, no clipboard. He sat down across the waiting area from Alyssa. Not adjacent, not close, across, the specific distance of someone who wanted a clear, unobstructed view of a particular chair. He did not look at her. Or rather, and this was the more precise and more unsettling observation, he looked at her in the way people looked at things they had already finished assessing. Not with the attention of someone gathering information, with the attention of someone confirming what they already knew. Alyssa held her phone in her lap and breathed and thought, he is not police. She knew police. She had sat across from police in rooms like this more times than she could count. Police had a texture to their waiting, watchful, but with a particular institutional impatience underneath, the impatience of people accustomed to moving a situation toward resolution on their own timeline. This man had no impatience. He had the absolute stillness of someone for whom patience was not a virtue, but a professional instrument. He was not media, not hospital administration, not a relative of anyone being treated, because relatives of people being treated had a specific gravity to them, a heaviness that lived in their shoulders and their hands that you could not fake and could not suppress. He was someone who had come to this waiting room because Alyssa was in it. She stood up, measured, unhurried. She walked to the vending machine on the far wall and studied its contents with the focused attention of a woman who had decided that a bag of pretzels was the most important thing happening in her life at this moment. She fed $1 into the machine. She waited for it. She took the pretzels. She did not look at the man in the gray suit. But she had repositioned herself so that his reflection was visible in the dark screen of a powered-down information kiosk to her right. He had not moved, but his head had, fractionally, just enough to maintain sightline. Alyssa walked back to her chair by a slightly different route, past the nurse's station, close enough to the desk to confirm that the red phone's indicator light was now on. Standby. Active. She sat down. She opened the pretzels. She thought about Sanghee's closed fist, somewhere in a treatment room down that hallway, holding whatever she had been holding on that road. Still, Alyssa had to believe holding it. Because if Sanghee was conscious enough to have been deliberately holding something before the crash, she was potentially conscious enough to make choices now about what she held onto. And if someone in this hospital had already made a phone call and killed 4 security cameras and sent a man in a well-tailored suit to sit across a waiting room from a woman in a bloody shirt, then whatever was in that girl's hand was the reason. She ate a pretzel. She thought, I need to get to that room before he does. She thought, I need to understand what I have walked into before I take another step in any direction. She thought Disung knew. He knew this would happen, and he told me with his last available breath, and I said I would stay, and I am still here, and that means something has already been decided. The man in the gray suit crossed his legs, settled, waiting with the comfort of someone who knew, with complete certainty, that the thing they were waiting for was not going anywhere. Alyssa looked at the television, a weather map, a front moving in from the northwest, rain by Thursday. The tattoos on a man's skin don't tell you who he is. They tell you what he survived. The question Alyssa was sitting with now, in a plastic chair under lights that hummed in a frequency just below comfort, was simpler and more urgent than anything the city had handed her in 20 years. Not who sent the man in the gray suit, not who killed the cameras, not even what was in Sang-hee's hand. The question was, how long before they stop watching and start moving? The decision did not arrive dramatically. That was the thing about the decisions that changed everything. They didn't announce themselves with the weight they deserved. They arrived quietly in the middle of something else, disguised as the only available option. Alyssa had seen it happen to other people 100 times. The mother who took in the nephew because there was no one else. The neighbor who signed the form because the social worker was standing there, and the child was standing there, and the pen was in her hand. The ordinary person who looked at an impossible situation and thought, well, someone has to. At 2:23 a.m., Alyssa walked down the hallway toward the treatment rooms. She did not run. She did not look back at the man in the gray suit. She moved with the specific, purposeful calm of a woman who belonged in this corridor, lanyard or no lanyard, folder or no folder, because belonging in a corridor was less about credentials and more about the quality of your walk. 20 years of entering spaces where she wasn't entirely welcome had taught her that. Hospitals, like courtrooms and government offices, and the living rooms of people who hadn't asked for a social worker and didn't want one, responded to certainty. You walked like you had already been told yes, and were simply following through on the arrangement. The nurse at the treatment wing desk looked up. Alyssa met her eyes and said, "Room 4, the young woman, head laceration, I need to check on her." She said it the way you stated a fact that had already been agreed upon, not a question, not a request. The nurse checked her screen. "Are you family?" "I'm the one who brought her in." Also a fact. Also not an answer to the question asked. Alyssa had learned that in bureaucratic exchanges, the precise answering of questions was optional if the alternative answer was accurate and delivered with sufficient conviction. The nurse looked at her screen again, then at Alyssa. Then at whatever she saw in Alyssa's face, which was not desperation and not aggression and not anything that required a response beyond a slight nod toward the left corridor. "Room 4, third door." Sang-hee was awake. Not fully, not in the way that meant she was present in any organized sense, but her eyes were open, dark, unfocused, moving across the ceiling in the slow, exploratory way of someone whose brain was reestablishing its relationship with consciousness one connection at a time. An IV in her left arm, a dressing on her forehead. The hospital gown they'd put her in had pushed up slightly on one side to reveal the edge of what had been, before the crash, a silk dress. Ivory. The kind of fabric that cost more than Alyssa's monthly grocery budget. Her right hand was under the blanket. Alyssa pulled the chair close and sat. She did not touch the girl. She did not speak immediately. She waited the way she had learned to wait in rooms where a person's mind was trying to find its footing, until Sang-hee's eyes moved and found her face and stayed there. "You stopped," Sang-hee said. Her English was accented but precise. The diction of someone educated in it deliberately, as a second language taken seriously. "I stopped," Alyssa confirmed. A pause. The monitors beeped their steady, indifferent rhythm. Somewhere down the corridor, a door opened and closed. "My father. He's here. He's being treated." She kept her voice at the register she used for delivering difficult truths to people who needed them delivered without decoration. "He's not awake yet, but he's here." Sang-hee closed her eyes. Something in her face shifted, not grief exactly, but the particular rearrangement of features that happened when someone absorbed information they had been bracing for and found it was survivable. She breathed. Then her eyes opened again. "They will come," she said, not a question. "I know. You should leave." Alyssa looked at her. "You should probably not be in this hospital under your real name, and you probably already know that." Sang-hee looked at her for a long moment. The unfocused quality in her eyes was resolving, Alyssa noticed, sharpening, which raised a question she didn't yet have enough information to ask. "There is a man," Sang-hee said carefully, "in the waiting area." Gray suit, 50s, came from the elevator. Something crossed Sang-hee's face, swift and controlled, but Alyssa caught it. Recognition. And beneath the recognition, something older. Something that had been living in the girl's body long enough to have made itself at home there. Fear, "We need to go," Sang-hee said. The logistics of moving a recently treated trauma patient out of an ER without triggering an alert were not, it turned out, entirely beyond the skill set of a woman who had spent 2 decades navigating institutional systems with inadequate resources. The IV came out. Sang-hee removed it herself, efficiently, without flinching, in a way that suggested this was not her first experience with medical equipment. The hospital gown stayed on underneath her clothes. Alyssa found the silk dress folded on the chair in the corner and helped Sang-hee pull it over the gown without touching the bandaged areas, because cold air on a recovering head wound was a problem they could manage, and everything else was a problem they would manage next. The right hand stayed, closed the entire time. Alyssa did not ask, not yet, but she watched. They left through the stairwell exit, not the main corridor, not past the nurse's station, not anywhere near the waiting area or the elevators, or whatever the man in the gray suit had arranged for himself in the 40 minutes Alyssa had been sitting in his sightline. The stairwell smelled like industrial cleaner and faint rust. Sang-hee descended with one hand on the railing and the other, the closed one pressed against her side, and she did not stumble, and she did not ask for help, and this too was information. They came out through the ambulance bay into air that had gotten colder in the hours since Alyssa had last been outside. Nearly 3 in the morning. The sky was doing the thing it did before dawn in this city, not dark, not light, but a particular bruised gray that suggested the darkness was tired of itself. Alyssa's Civic was in the visitor lot, 2 levels up, exactly where she'd left it. She had her keys in her hand before they cleared the bay doors, the muscle memory of a woman who did not pause in parking structures. Sang-hee got in the passenger seat. She looked at the stack of manila folders and said nothing. Alyssa started the car. She knew before she turned onto her street. The black SUV was parked at the hydrant in front of her building. Not illegally in the way that people parked illegally at hydrants, slightly over the line, hazards on, temporary. This was parked with the settled permanence of something that had been there for hours and expected to remain. Engine off, windows dark, no plates visible from her approach angle. She drove past without slowing. The specific, practiced nonchalance of someone who lived on this street and was coming home from a late night and had no reason to look twice at any particular vehicle. In her peripheral vision, the SUV did not move. She turned at the corner, pulled over, sat. Someone knew where she lived before she made a single choice tonight. The thought arrived with the flat, cold clarity of a fact that had been waiting for her to catch up to it. She had given her name at the ER desk. But the SUV had been there, she was certain, reconstructing the timeline with the precision the situation demanded before she called 911 on that road, before she gave any name anywhere. Which meant the SUV was not a response to her. Which meant it was already part of what had happened to Disung and Sang-hee before the crash. Which meant someone had been watching Alyssa Bittens, on Route 9, on a Tuesday night, before a luxury sedan went wheels up on a road nobody powerful used. The man at the bus stop, his coat, the quality of his stillness. She thought, how long have I been in this picture without knowing I was in this picture? Sang-hee was quiet in the passenger seat. Her head was turned toward the window. Alyssa could see the girl's reflection in the glass, eyes open, tracking the street. Not the eyes of someone concussed. Not the eyes of someone whose memory was fragmented and searching. Sharp, precise, reading the street the way Alyssa read rooms. They went in through the building's back entrance, the service door off the alley that Alyssa had used twice in 3 years, both times to bring in furniture too large for the lobby. She had a key for it. She had a key for most things in her building that weren't her apartment, not because she had acquired them improperly, but because 20 years of being the person people called when something needed handling had a way of resulting in a keychain that was heavier than strictly necessary. The back stairwell was narrow, unlit except for the emergency exit signs, which threw everything in red. Sang-hee moved up the stairs with Alyssa close behind. And they did not speak because the stairwell had a particular acoustic quality that carried sound upward, and neither of them had anything to say that was for anyone else's ears. 3rd floor, Alyssa's end of the hall. Mrs. Perkins from 3B was standing in her doorway. This was not unusual. Mrs. Perkins was 71 years old and a light sleeper, and had, in the 3 years Alyssa had lived on this floor, been present in her doorway at odd hours enough times that Alyssa had stopped being surprised by it. She was a small woman with the specific observational patience of someone who had decided that watching was its own form of participation in the world. She looked at Alyssa. She looked at Sang-hee. Her gaze went specifically, deliberately, to the hem of the silk dress visible below Sang-hee's coat, ivory fabric against the hall's dim light, unmistakable in its quality, entirely incongruous with this floor, this building, this corridor with its water-stained carpet and its flickering bulb at the far end. Mrs. Perkins looked back at Alyssa. Alyssa held her gaze. She did not explain. She did not perform normalcy in a way that would require a script she hadn't prepared. She simply looked at her neighbor the way you looked at someone you had lived near long enough to trust, and waited. Mrs. Perkins stepped back into her apartment and closed her door. Not loudly, not with the pointed emphasis of someone making a statement about what they had or hadn't seen. Just closed it. The soft click of a woman who had decided that whatever was happening in this hallway at 3 a.m. was not her business to make difficult. Alyssa breathed. She got her door open. She got Sang-hee inside. She got the door closed and the deadbolt turned. The apartment was exactly as she'd left it. Case files on the table. One working burner on the stove. The photograph on the refrigerator. The rug over the water stain. The particular smell of a space that was lived in alone, not unpleasant, but spare, like a room that had made peace with its own dimensions. Sang-hee stood in the middle of it and looked around slowly, taking inventory the way she took inventory of everything, with the systematic attention of someone accustomed to assessing environments for their utility and their risk. Then she opened her hand. Alyssa looked. A USB drive. Small, black, unremarkable except for a strip of silver tape on one side on which someone had written, in very small characters, a string of numbers that meant nothing to Alyssa and clearly meant everything to everyone who had been on that road tonight. Sang-hee looked at her. The sharpness in her eyes was fully present now, undeniable. "You thought I didn't remember," she said, not accusing, observing. Alyssa said nothing. "I remember everything." Sang-hee closed her fingers around the drive again. "I need you to understand what that means for both of us before you decide if you are still willing to stay. The problem with saving someone is that they might not want to be saved. The harder problem, the one Alyssa was standing in the middle of at 3 a.m. in her own living room, is when the person you saved doesn't need saving at all. When they came to you already knowing exactly what they were doing. Was Sang-hee a girl running from danger? Or a girl who had driven directly into it, with a USB drive in her fist and a plan Alyssa wasn't part of yet? The first thing Alyssa did was make oatmeal. Not because it was the right time for oatmeal. It was 3:40 in the morning, and the right time for oatmeal existed in no philosophy she was aware of, but because the apartment needed something domestic to happen in it. Something that smelled like a decision to stay. She had learned this from 20 years of entering homes in crisis. The first ordinary thing you did after the extraordinary thing redrew the room's emotional geography. It said, "We are going to survive this particular hour." It said, "The stove works and we are using it." It said nothing about tomorrow, which was correct, because tomorrow was a problem that required a completely different set of tools. Sang-hee sat at the kitchen table and watched her. The USB drive was in the pocket of the hospital gown, which was still layered beneath the silk dress, which was creased and road-stained now in ways that rendered its original price tag irrelevant. She had not offered to change into anything else, and Alyssa had not offered anything to change into, because the apartment did not contain clothing that would fit a 17-year-old who was several inches shorter and several decades younger, and improvising that particular problem at 3:40 in the morning was below both of them. "Honey," Alyssa said. Not a question. She already knew. She had watched Sang-hee's eyes move to the jar on the counter with the specific recognition of someone nodding a preference, not a stranger cataloging an unfamiliar kitchen. Sang-hee said, "Please." Alyssa added honey. She put the bowl on the table. She stood on the other side of the counter with her own coffee, the gas station cup, long cold, nursed past the point of any reasonable enjoyment, and waited while Sang-hee ate. The girl ate carefully, not the carefulness of someone without appetite, but the deliberate packing of someone who understood that eating too fast after trauma was its own problem. She held the spoon the way people held things when they were managing pain, not gripping, but precise. Her head wound had been properly dressed at the hospital, but Alyssa had noted the particular tension in Sang-hee's jaw that meant the local anesthetic was wearing off. She did not comment on it. Sang-hee would ask for what she needed when she needed it, or she wouldn't, and either way Alyssa was not going to position herself as the person managing the girl's relationship with her own pain. When the bowl was half empty, Sang-hee said, "You live alone." "Yes." "You have lived alone for a long time." It wasn't a question, so Alyssa didn't treat it as one. "The files on the table," Sang-hee's eyes moved to them, "those are children." "Cases, yes." "You carry them home." "I carry them everywhere." Sang-hee looked at her with an expression that was difficult to categorize, not pity, not judgment, but something more careful than either, the expression of someone recalibrating an assessment. "My father's people also carry their work home," she said, "but they do not put it in folders." The apartment's second bedroom was technically a second bedroom in the same way that the one working burner was technically a full kitchen. It contained a filing cabinet, a folding table, 3 boxes of case documents that predated the city's transition to digital records, and against the far wall, a daybed that Alyssa had acquired from a client who was moving and couldn't take it, which she had kept with the vague intention of having guests and the clear knowledge that she did not have guests. She made it up with the spare set of sheets, gray, clean, pulled from the linen closet with the mechanical efficiency of a woman who did not attach ceremony to hospitality, because hospitality for her was functional rather than performative. Sang-hee stood in the doorway and looked at the filing cabinet. "Is that locked?" she asked. "Yes." "What's in it?" Alyssa looked at her. "Things that are locked." Sang-hee accepted this with a nod that suggested she would return to the question when the timing was better, which was not acceptance so much as tactical postponement. Alyssa recognized the maneuver because she used it herself. She left Sang-hee with instructions. Do not open the window. Do not turn on the overhead light. Do not answer any sound at the door, delivered in the low, unhurried voice she used for instructions that were non-negotiable without being hostile. Sang-hee listened without interrupting, which was either compliance or the performance of compliance, and either way the instructions had been given. Alyssa pulled the door, most of the way closed. She went to the kitchen table. She moved the case files to one side. She sat down and she allowed herself, for exactly 3 minutes, to put her face in her hands and breathe. Then she got up and went to the hall closet and reached past the winter coats she never wore and the umbrella with the broken spoke, and the box of her mother's things she had moved 4 times without opening, and she took down the metal lockbox from the top shelf. The pistol was a Glock 19 9mm, purchased legally 11 years ago during a period of her career when she had been making home visits in a neighborhood where 2 of her colleagues had been followed to their cars. She had carried it for 8 months. She had never fired it outside of the range. She had put it in the lockbox and put the lockbox in the closet, and spent the subsequent decade, and some telling herself, she had kept it for practical reasons that had nothing to do with the specific night she had decided she was done being afraid in a way that made her passive. She set it on the table. She got the cleaning kit from the same shelf. She sat down and began the process, methodical, unhurried, of cleaning a weapon she had not touched in 3 years. Not because she intended to use it, because her hands needed something that required precision and attention and produced, at the end, something more reliable than it had been at the start. Because the apartment had a girl in the back room with a USB drive full of information that multiple dangerous parties were actively searching for, and a black SUV at the hydrant outside, and somewhere across the city a man in a coma who was the only person whose waking up would make any of this simpler. Because Alyssa Bittens had made a promise on a dark road, and she was not, in her marrow, in the irreducible core of what 20 years had left of her, a person who broke promises to dying men. She ran the bore brush through the barrel. She worked without rushing. The apartment was quiet in the specific way that apartments were quiet when they contained more people than usual, a quality of occupied silence, of another person's breathing adjusting the room's atmosphere in ways too subtle to name but too present to ignore. She thought about the filing cabinet. Sang-hee had asked about it within 40 minutes of arriving, which meant it had been among the first things she assessed when she entered the apartment. Which meant she was doing what Alyssa suspected she had been doing since she opened her eyes in room 4 and found Alyssa in the chair beside her, cataloging, evaluating, making decisions about what to reveal and what to withhold and in what sequence. The filing cabinet was locked because what it contained was not for cases. The cases lived on the table, in folders, accessible, professional. The filing cabinet was for the thing that Alyssa had spent 11 years finding better containers for and failing. One drawer held the documentation of her daughter. Not a case file, not in the professional sense. Her daughter had been 4 years old and had been removed from Alyssa's care during a period of Alyssa's life that she did not discuss and had not discussed and would. She had long ago concluded, probably not discuss until something forced the conversation in a direction she could not redirect. The system she worked for had taken her child. The same machinery she operated daily, the same forms she filled out in other people's names, had been filed about her. By a colleague she had trusted. During a custody dispute with a man who understood, with the precise cruelty of the particular, that the system Alyssa believed in could be weaponized against her. Her daughter would be 15 now. Alyssa knew where she was. She did not make contact, because the terms of the arrangement she had eventually negotiated, not through the courts, through the kind of quiet, bilateral understanding that left no paper trail, required a particular kind of restraint that Alyssa exercised the way she exercised everything difficult, daily, without acknowledgement, without asking anyone to notice. She reassembled the pistol. She checked the safety twice. She set it on the table to her left. She looked at the photograph on the refrigerator. A 4-year-old girl in a yellow dress, squinting against sunlight, laughing at something outside the frame. The magnet from a conference she had attended when she still believed that attending conferences meant something. She thought, this is why I stopped. Not for Desung, not for the voice on the road, not for the tattoos or the skid marks or the man in the gray suit or the USB drive. All of that was real and all of it mattered, but beneath it, in the sedimentary layer where the real reasons lived, was this. A woman who had once failed to protect something small and irreplaceable had been handed, on a dark highway, another chance to stand between a girl and a world that wanted to use her. Alyssa was not naive enough to call it redemption. She was too tired for that kind of vocabulary. She called it the only available option. The knock came at 4:17 a.m. 3 sounds, measured, not aggressive, not hesitant. The knock of someone who had decided that knocking was the appropriate approach and was executing it with professional composure. Alyssa was on her feet before the 3rd knock finished. The pistol was in her hand, safety on, held low, the grip of someone who remembered her training if not her comfort with what the training prepared her for. She moved to the door in the dark, not turning on any light, and stood to the side of the frame rather than in front of it. "Who is it?" she said, not loudly, at the level of someone who expected the person on the other side to be close enough to hear without needing volume. A pause. Then, Mrs. Perkins, from 3B. Alyssa stood in the dark and processed this for 3 full seconds. She opened the door. Mrs. Perkins was in a house robed the color of deep green water and slippers that had seen considerable use. She was holding, with both hands, a covered pot that emanated steam and the smell of something with ginger in it. She looked at Alyssa with the particular expression of a 71-year-old woman who had seen enough of the world to have stopped being surprised by the configurations it arranged itself into at 4 in the morning. Her eyes went to Alyssa's right hand. Alyssa moved the pistol behind her back. Mrs. Perkins looked at her face. Then she held out the pot. "For the girl," she said. "Pepper soup. It's better for a head wound than oatmeal." She said it in the tone of someone correcting a small, forgivable error. "And you should know," she paused, adjusted her grip on the pot, "the SUV at the hydrant. There are 2 men in it now. There was one when you came home." Elissa took the pot. "I didn't see anything," Mrs. Perkins said, "and I won't." She looked past Elissa's shoulder, down the dark hallway toward the back bedroom, then back. "But you should also know that Mr. Shelby in 1A called someone tonight, about 20 minutes after you came in through the back." She said it flatly, without drama, the way you told a neighbor something they needed to know because the alternative was worse. Then she turned and walked back to 3B. A woman who asks for nothing has taken in a girl who remembers everything. A neighbor who sees everything has chosen, for now, to see nothing. And a man in a parked SUV has become 2 men, which means the watching has shifted into something with more personnel and therefore more intention. The question that sat on Elissa's kitchen table next to a cleaned pistol and a covered pot of pepper soup was not whether they were coming. The question was whether Mr. Shelby's phone call had already decided when. She did not sleep. This was not unusual. Elissa had a complicated relationship with sleep that predated the current situation by approximately a decade. But the particular quality of her wakefulness between 4 and 7 in the morning was different from her ordinary insomnia. Ordinary insomnia was passive. It was lying in the dark while her brain processed the accumulated residue of other people's emergencies. This was active. This was sitting at the kitchen table with cold pepper soup and a cleaned pistol and a legal pad on which she had written, in the small, precise handwriting she used for case notes, everything she knew and everything she suspected, and the distance between those 2 categories. The distance was considerable. What she knew: a car had been run off Route 9 by something or someone that had left skid marks inconsistent with an accident. Disung was in a coma at Mercy General under a name that was not his own, in a wing whose security cameras had been disabled by parties unknown. Sang-hee was asleep in the back room with a USB drive she had been holding before the crash, which meant she had taken it from somewhere intentionally before getting in that car. A man in a gray suit had come from the hospital's upper floors to sit across a waiting room from Elissa. 2 men were in an SUV at the hydrant downstairs. Mr. Shelby in 1A had made a phone call. What she suspected, enough to fill the rest of the legal pad and still leave questions that the pad couldn't contain. At 6:50, she heard Sang-hee moving in the back room. Careful sounds, the specific quiet of someone navigating an unfamiliar space without wanting to announce it. Elissa had made those sounds in other people's homes. She recognized their shape. She put the legal pad under the case files. She put the pistol in the cabinet above the refrigerator, safety on, behind a box of rice she never cooked. She put water on for tea. Sang-hee appeared in the kitchen doorway in the hospital gown, the silk dress folded over her arm with a neatness that seemed reflexive rather than deliberate. Her hair was loose. The bandaging on her forehead was intact. She looked at the legal pad's edge visible beneath the folders, then at Elissa, then at the kettle. "There is a man outside," she said. "On the street, not the SUV, different man. He arrived at 6:30. Elissa poured water into 2 cups. "What does he look like?" "Like someone who wants to look like he belongs." Sang-hee sat at the table. "He doesn't." They drank tea. Outside, the city assembled itself into mourning with its usual indifference. Detective Raymond Halloway knocked at 9:14 a.m. He did not buzz from the lobby. He knocked at the apartment door, which meant he had come through the building's front entrance, which meant someone, Mr. Shelby, the super, someone with access, had let him in without requiring Elissa to grant entry. She noted this. She noted everything in the seconds between the knock and her movement toward the door, which she spent not in panic, but in the rapid, practical triage of the room's current state. The back bedroom door, closed, good. The extra pair of shoes, Sang-hee's flats, the one she'd been wearing under the silk dress, small and narrow and unmistakably not Elissa's size, sitting at the end of the hallway where Sang-hee had left them the night before. Not good. Alyssa picked them up in one motion as she passed, opened the closet, placed them inside, closed it. 4 seconds. She smoothed her expression into the particular neutral she wore for institutional confrontations, not hostile, not deferential, not giving anything away that hadn't already been taken. She opened the door. Raymond Halloway was 52 years old and dressed in a charcoal suit that was not expensive the way the gray suit man's had been expensive. It was expensive the way a city detective's suit was expensive when the detective in question understood that clothing was a tool of professional authority and invested accordingly. The cut was deliberate. The tie was dark blue and straight. He wore it all with the ease of someone for whom the suit was not costume, but uniform, not something put on but something inhabited. He was also smiling. This was the first thing Alyssa registered, and the thing that required the most immediate recalibration. She had prepared herself for a version of this encounter that began with the weight of official authority, with the presentation of a badge, and the particular verbal cadence of someone who had rehearsed the opening of a difficult conversation. She had not prepared for a smile. Not because she was naive about the tactical uses of warmth. She employed them herself daily. But because the specific smile Halloway was wearing was not the smile of someone performing pleasantness to disarm a suspect. It was the smile of someone who already knew the punchline. Ms. Bittens. He said her name the way people said names they had been reading in a file, with the slight additional weight of familiarity that hadn't been earned through meeting. I'm Detective Halloway. I left a card in your mailbox a few weeks back. I remember. May I? He gestured toward the interior of the apartment with a hand that was open, unthreatening, and entirely confident that the answer would eventually be yes. Alyssa did not move from the doorway. What is this about, detective? A car accident on Route 9, last night. He said it conversationally, the way you mentioned weather. You were the 911 caller. I was. Then I imagine you know what it's about. The smile adjusted slightly, not disappearing but recalibrating, acknowledging that the opening move had been met with something more composed than he'd perhaps expected. I have some questions about what you saw, and what you did after. I waited at the hospital until I knew the patients were stable. Then I came home. That's what I did after. And you're home now, he looked at her, resting. Working. She held up a case folder she had picked up from the table on her way to the door. It was, in fact, a real case folder containing real case notes. She had calculated this detail. Halloway's eyes moved past her shoulder. Not obviously, he was too practiced for obvious, but in the specific way that trained observers scanned a room when given a partial sightline, collecting peripheral data without appearing to collect it. His eyes stopped, briefly, at the end of the hallway. Alyssa did not look. She already knew what he had seen, which was nothing. The shoes were in the closet. The bedroom door was closed. The hallway contained nothing that didn't belong to a woman who lived alone. But Halloway had stopped at the end of the hallway the way people stopped when they saw something or the absence of something that didn't align with what they'd expected to find. She thought he knew to look there, which means someone described the layout to him. Mr. Shelby's phone call. I'd rather do this inside, Halloway said pleasantly, but if you prefer the porch, that works too. The porch was 3 feet of shared landing outside her door with a view of the stairwell and no interior access. Alyssa stepped out and pulled the door behind her, not entirely closed, not locked. She turned to face him in the reduced space and let the door rest against the frame with the studied casualness of a woman who simply hadn't latched it. Halloway leaned against the stairwell railing. He was comfortable with compression, with small spaces and close distances, and the interrogative intimacy of a conversation where there was nowhere to move without it meaning something. She recognized the technique. She used a version of it herself in small offices with difficult parents. The man from the accident, he said, Sun Disung. He watched her face when he said the name. She gave it nothing. You know who he is, Halloway said, not a question. I know what a 911 dispatcher knows. Name, location, condition. They told me at intake. They told you his name was Disung. They told me a name. She held his gaze. Is that not his name? The smile again. Slower this time, and with a different quality underneath. Not warmth, not the performance of it, but something closer to respect. The expression of a man recalibrating an opponent upward. Ms. Bittens, you're a social worker. 20 years with the city. You've worked cases in neighborhoods that overlap with the Sun Syndicate's operations for at least the last 8 of those 20 years. He said it without accusation, with the measured neutrality of someone presenting a chronology. You know the name. Knowing a name from a neighborhood and knowing a man are different things. They are, he nodded. What about his daughter? Here, this was the moment. Alyssa had prepared for this moment across the entire sleepless architecture of the night, had anticipated its shape, its angle, the specific terrain of it. She had prepared for it the way she prepared for home visits to addresses that had previous incident reports, with information, with composure, and with the clear-eyed understanding that what she said in the next 4 seconds would establish the ground on which everything else was negotiated. The girl from the accident, she said, was treated and released. I don't know where she went after that. Halloway looked at her. She looked back. Treated and released, he repeated, at Mercy General. That's where the ambulance went. Interesting. He reached into his jacket and removed a small notebook, physical, not digital, the choice of someone who understood that physical notes were less searchable, and opened it with the deliberateness of a man who wanted her to watch him do it. Because Mercy General's records show she was admitted, but the discharge paperwork is, he paused, reading, incomplete, which usually means the patient left before the process was finished. That happens, Alyssa said. People leave hospitals before the paperwork is done. You probably know that better than I do. I do. He closed the notebook. And the security cameras in the ER between 1 and 3 a.m. What about them? They were offline. He watched her. Technical issue according to the hospital. Those things happen too. They do. He smiled. This version of the smile was the most complex one yet layered, containing several simultaneous things, the top layer of which was amusement, and below which were other things she was still identifying. Ms. Bittens, I want to be straightforward with you because I think you're a straightforward person, and I think the indirect approach wastes both our time. She waited. I've been building a case against the Sun Syndicate for 14 months. Disung was the center of it. The accident last night was not an accident. It was an internal hit, orchestrated by his second-in-command, who has been moving against him for 6 weeks. He said it with the flatness of fact. His daughter is the only person alive who has access to the documentation that proves it, which means she is currently the most wanted person in this city by people who do not operate within any legal framework I can use to protect her. He let that sit. A social worker's apartment, he continued, is not a safe place for the most wanted person in the city. He said it without cruelty, with the measured, even delivery of a man who believed he was stating an obvious truth in service of an obvious good. I'm not here to arrest you. I'm here because you are in a situation that is significantly more dangerous than you appear to understand, and I have resources that you don't. Alyssa looked at him for a long moment. She thought about his father, the corrupt cop, the details Sang-hee had mentioned in the hospital with a specificity that suggested it was not incidental information. She thought about the 14-month case and what 14 months of building a case against a syndicate did to a detective's relationship with the line between the law and the outcome he needed the law to produce. She thought about a man who was right about the danger and potentially wrong about everything else. You said you wanted to be straightforward, she said. I did. Then be straightforward about the man you had watching my building at 6:30 this morning, before you knocked. The smile didn't disappear, but for the first time since he'd arrived on her landing, it stopped moving. It became fixed in a way that smiles became fixed when the person wearing them had made a rapid internal adjustment and was waiting for their face to catch up. Surveillance is standard procedure in an active. Before you knocked, Alyssa said again, quietly. Which means the surveillance preceded the courtesy visit, which means you already knew I was relevant before you decided to be straightforward with me. She held the folder against her chest. Straightforward people lead with that. Halloway looked at her. Something shifted behind his eyes, not guilt, not quite, but the particular recalibration of a man who had arrived expecting a certain kind of conversation and found himself in a different one. "The man at the bus stop," he said finally. "On Delmore and 9th, last night." She said nothing. "That was mine." He said it without apology, without explanation, simply laying it on the landing between them like an object he was done carrying. "I've been watching your route for 10 days, because your name appears in the intake documentation of 3 children who were recruited into Sun Syndicate operations over the past 2 years, not as a participant, as the social worker who filed the original removal orders." He paused. "Someone inside the syndicate has been flagging your cases. I needed to know if you knew." The morning air between them held this information. Alyssa processed it with the stillness she had spent decades building, not because it didn't land, not because it wasn't significant, but because the moment she let Halloway see it land was the moment the negotiation ended and something else began. "I didn't know," she said. "I believe you." He reached into his jacket again and produced the business card, same as the one from the mailbox, white, minimal, and held it out. "When she's ready to talk to me, I need her to know I'm not the enemy." Alyssa took the card. She did not confirm that there was a her to be ready. Halloway pushed off the railing. He straightened his jacket with the small, self-contained gesture of a man concluding a meeting that had not gone entirely as planned and was making peace with that. He looked at her one more time, not at the door, not at the hallway beyond it, not at anything except her face. "Your cases," he said quietly. "The children, someone's been using your paperwork as a recruitment map." He turned toward the stairs. "That's worth being angry about." He descended, without looking back. Alyssa stood on the landing and listened to his footsteps reach the ground floor. She waited until she heard the building's front door close. She counted to 30. She went inside. Sang-hee was standing in the kitchen hallway. She had heard everything. Her face said she had heard everything. Her hand was in her pocket where the USB drive was. "He's not wrong," she said, "about the danger." "No," Alyssa agreed. "He's not wrong about that. But he's not telling you everything." "No," Alyssa said. "He's not telling me everything." They looked at each other across the narrow kitchen in the morning light. "The drive," Sang-hee said. "It has names on it, names of people inside the police department." She said it without drama, without the performance of revelation, simply with the flat precision of someone statting a coordinate. "That is why they want it. That is why the cameras went dark. That is why the man in the gray suit was at the hospital." She looked at Alyssa. "That is why Halloway was on your route for 10 days before my father's car went off that road. A detective with a 14-month case. A girl with a drive full of names. A social worker standing in her own kitchen understanding, for the first time with complete clarity, that the road chose her because someone needed her to be choosable. The tattoos on a dying man's skin don't tell you who he is, but the names on a USB drive tell you exactly who everyone else is. 3 days passed in the specific suspended quality of time, inside a small apartment with the blinds mostly closed. Alyssa had taken emergency personal leave from the city 2 days, which was all she had accumulated without triggering a supervisory review, submitted electronically with the explanation family medical matter, and the flat certainty that her supervisor, who had 17 open cases of her own and a department running at 60% capacity, would process the request without scrutiny. She was correct. The approval came back in 40 minutes. She did not think of it as lying. She thought of it as deploying available language toward a necessary outcome, which was a distinction she would have argued about with herself in better circumstances. The apartment had reorganized itself around 2 occupants without either of them explicitly negotiating the terms. Sang-hee had claimed the kitchen table between 9 and noon for something she did with the laptop Alyssa had placed in the back room, work that Alyssa did not ask about, because the asking would require a level of knowledge about what was on the USB drive that she had decided, deliberately, to defer. What you didn't know, you couldn't be required to explain. Alyssa had learned this from watching people in deposition prep and applying it, with quiet consistency, to her own life. Sang-hee had learned, without being asked, to live small. This was the thing that surprised Alyssa most, not the girl's intelligence, which she had assessed within the first 20 minutes of the hospital room and revised upward twice since, but her adaptability. The way she had shed, layer by layer, the infrastructure of the person she had been. She ate what was available without comment. She kept her space with a neatness that was not performative but habitual, the neatness of someone who had been taught that disorder was a security liability. She spoke when she had something to say, and was silent when she didn't, which in Alyssa's experience was a skill that most adults had not mastered. She did not ask about the locked filing cabinet again. But on the second morning, Alyssa had come into the kitchen and found a cup of tea already made, placed at her usual seat, still hot. Sang-hee was at the table with her back to the kitchen, the laptop open, apparently occupied. She did not turn around or acknowledge the tea or the making of it. Alyssa drank it. That was the bond, in its essential form. Not the dramatic version, not the conversation that resolved everything, not the moment of mutual revelation that movies required to signal connection. Just a cup of tea placed where it would be found. Just a small, accurate act of attention that asked for nothing back. On the third day, Alyssa's phone rang at 7 in the morning. She did not recognize the number. She answered because not answering unknown numbers was a luxury that people without her job description could afford. The voice was female, young, speaking quickly and quietly in a register that suggested proximity to something she didn't want overheard. "You brought in the girl with the head laceration 3 nights ago." Alyssa was already standing. She moved to the window, looked at the street, the SUV was still there, different plates now, same position, and spoke at the same low level the caller was using. "Who is this?" "The nurse, short hair, I know you saw me on the phone." A pause, the sound of a door somewhere behind her voice. Opening and closing. "I need you to understand something. The call I made that night, it wasn't to them. I need you to know that before I tell you this." Alyssa said nothing. She waited. "The man from the accident, the one on the 3rd floor." Another pause. "He moved his fingers this morning, both hands. The attending documented it at 6:42. Everything in Alyssa's chest rearranged itself. "The neurology team is saying he could achieve consciousness within 48 hours, maybe less." The nurse's voice dropped further. "I'm telling you because there's someone on that floor who isn't staff, has been there since yesterday, sits in the family waiting area and doesn't talk to anyone. When I asked him which patient he was there for, he gave me a name that isn't on our intake roster for that wing." "What does he look like?" "50s, gray coat. He reads a newspaper he never turns the page of." "The man from the waiting room. Not gray suit this time, gray coat, but the same architecture. The same quality of deliberate, patient stillness. The same presence that existed in a space not to wait but to watch and, when the moment specified, to act." "How many people know about the finger movement?" Alyssa said. "The attending, me, the night nurse who was in the room." A beat. "And whoever the man in the gray coat called immediately after I documented it, because he left the floor for 6 minutes and came back and his newspaper was in a different position." Alyssa pressed her hand flat against the window glass. Cold. The street below with its ordinary morning indifference. "Why are you telling me this?" A silence long enough to contain a decision being finalized. "Because the girl's intake form had a next of kin line that was blank, and you filled it in." Another pause. "You wrote family friend, and you looked at me like you meant it, and I've been doing this job for 9 years, and I know the difference between someone performing care and someone who is actually scared for another person." The nurse exhaled. "He needs to wake up somewhere that isn't here." Sang-hee was in the kitchen doorway before Alyssa had fully turned from the window. She had heard enough. The apartment was small, and Alyssa's end of the conversation, even kept quiet, had carried. "He's waking up," Sang-hee said. 48 hours, maybe less. Something moved across the girl's face, relief and terror arriving simultaneously, fighting for the same square of expression, neither winning cleanly. She pressed her back against the door frame and looked at the ceiling for a moment, which was what people did when they needed to reassemble themselves without an audience for the process. Alyssa gave her the seconds. "The man from the hospital waiting room," Alyssa said. "Gray coat this time. He's on your father's floor." Sang-hee closed her eyes. "Bayam Jun." "Who?" "My father's second, the one who arranged the crash." She said it with the flat, stripped-down certainty of someone who had been sitting with this knowledge for 3 days and had run it through every available angle of doubt and arrived, each time at the same address. "He cannot allow my father to wake up and speak. The drive has the documentation of what he's been doing with the syndicate's operations while my father trusted him." She opened her eyes. "Bayam Jun has been building something parallel for 3 years. Using my father's infrastructure and my father's name without my father's knowledge. And your father found out." "The night of the crash, yes." She looked at the pocket of the folded hospital gown on the back of the chair, where the drive was. "The drive is my father's. He compiled it himself. He called me to his car that night because he had already identified what was coming, and he needed the documentation outside the syndicate's reach." Her jaw tightened. "He didn't tell me it would come as fast as it did." Alyssa processed this, laid it against what Halloway had told her on the landing, the 14-month case, the internal hit, the second-in-command moving against Disung for 6 weeks. Halloway's timeline and Sang-hee's aligned, which meant Halloway had more of the picture than he'd shown, and the piece he was missing, the piece that would make his 14 months of case-building prosecutable, was in the pocket of a hospital gown on the back of a kitchen chair. "If Bayam Jun gets to your father before he can speak," Alyssa said, "then the drive is the only remaining evidence, and he knows that, and he knows I have it." Sang-hee looked at her directly. "And now he knows my father is waking up, which means the 48 hours the nurse gave you is not 48 hours. It is however long it takes Bayam Jun to decide that waiting for an opportunity is less efficient than creating one." The refrigerator hummed. A bus passed on the street below. "We need to move your father," Alyssa said. "You cannot move a comatose patient from an ICU." "He's not comatose anymore. He's emerging, which is a different medical category with different protocols." She was already at the table, moving case files, finding the legal pad. "I know the patient transfer process. I've initiated emergency transfers for vulnerable adults in hostile living situations. The paperwork architecture is different, but the principle is the same: documented risk to patient safety, alternative placement, authorization from..." She stopped. "He needs someone to authorize the transfer. Family." They looked at each other. The hospital administrator on duty at Mercy General at 8:45 a.m. was a man named Gerald Prout who had, according to the staff directory Alyssa had found through the city's interagency database during 20 minutes of focused searching, worked in hospital administration for 23 years, and had a documented preference for resolving problems quietly and completely before they became visible to anyone above him in the organizational structure. Alyssa knew this profile. She had worked with its equivalent in 6 different city agencies. She knew exactly which door to knock on. She called the main desk and asked for patient transfer coordination, was transferred twice, and ended up with Prout's office directly. She identified herself as a licensed social worker conducting a welfare assessment on a patient whose safety she had documented concerns about. She used the specific language hostile third-party presence on the patient's floor, documented by nursing staff, patient in vulnerable emerging state. That triggered the administrative reflex she was counting on. Prout said he would look into it. Alyssa said she would call back in 30 minutes and that she was documenting the call time for her welfare assessment report. Prout said he would look into it now. She ended the call. She looked at the ceiling. She thought about the man in the gray coat and his unturned newspaper pages and the 6 minutes he had spent on a phone call after Disung's fingers moved. Sang-hee was watching her from across the table. "You're very good at that," she said. "At what?" "Making institutions do things they didn't plan to do." She said it without flattery, with the analytical attention she brought to everything. You make it sound like you're giving them an option when you're actually closing all the other doors first. Social work, Alyssa said simply. She was on her third call, this one to the attending neurologist's office, a voicemail she was constructing with the careful specificity of a document that would be listened to by multiple people, and therefore needed to be accurate and attributable and impossible to characterize as anything except professional concern, when her phone buzzed with a text from the nurse's number. She read it. She set the phone face down on the table with a steadiness that required active management. "What?" Sang-hee said. Alyssa picked the phone back up and read the text aloud, because Sang-hee was going to find out, and the manner in which she found out was the only variable still available to control. "The hospital is evacuating the third floor. Fire alarm. No fire confirmed by staff. Third floor only." She put the phone down again. "Your father's floor." Sang-hee stood up. The motion was swift and contained, the standing of someone whose body had made a decision before her mind had finished processing the information. "A targeted evacuation," she said. "Not a building alarm, just his floor." "Which means it's not about fire. It's about moving him. During the confusion. When the floor clears and the nursing staff is occupied with the protocol, and there are people in the hallways who don't belong there, and nobody is looking at one specific room, because everybody is looking at the evacuation." Alyssa was already reaching for her keys. Sang-hee's hand came down on the table between them. "You cannot go to that hospital. Your father is either already being moved by Baeomjun's people, in which case we are already too late, or he is still in that room, in which case the entire floor is waiting for anyone who shows up to claim him." Her voice was steady and surgical and correct in the way that was hardest to argue with. "You go to that hospital right now, and you walk into whatever they've built on that floor, and the drive disappears, and my father's death gets attributed to complications from the accident, and you spend the next 3 years explaining to a detective with a 14-month case why you were present at 2 separate scenes." The keys were in Alyssa's hand. She did not move. Outside, a siren, then another, then the specific overlapping frequency of multiple emergency vehicles assembling themselves toward a common address. Sang-hee took the USB drive from the hospital gown pocket. She placed it on the table between them, in the cleared space where the case files had been. She looked at it, then at Alyssa. "My father told me something on the road," she said, "before he lost consciousness, while you were on the phone with the dispatcher." She looked up. "He said, the woman who stops is the only one who can finish it." She paused. "I didn't understand what he meant by finish. I think I understand now." Alyssa looked at the drive on the table. She thought about Halloway's card, which was in her jacket pocket. She thought about a 14-month case that needed one thing she had been sitting 3 feet from for 3 days. She thought about a man in a hospital room whose fingers had moved, which meant something in him was still fighting toward the surface. She thought, the road chose it for me. "Call Halloway," Sang-hee said quietly. "Not because he deserves it, because he is the tool that fits this particular door." Alyssa picked up the drive. A father's fingers move toward a world that is trying to make sure he never reaches it. A daughter puts the most dangerous object in the city on a kitchen table and calls it a tool. And a woman who spent 20 years arriving after the damage is finally, for the first time, inside the moment before. The sirens outside are getting louder, which means the floor has cleared, which means the room is either empty or it isn't, which means the next 48 hours have just become something shorter and considerably less forgiving. Halloway answered on the second ring. Alyssa had not prepared a script. She had prepared, instead, a sequence, the order in which information would be delivered, each piece positioned to make the next one necessary, the whole structured the way she structured difficult conversations with resistant parents in airless offices. Lead with what they already know, follow with what they need, end with the only available conclusion. Give them the shape of the decision before they realize they're making it. She told him about the nurse, the finger movement, the gray coat and the unturned newspaper and the 6-minute phone call, the targeted evacuation on the 3rd floor. Halloway was quiet through most of it in a way that was not passive. She could hear him thinking, the quality of his silence shifting as each piece arrived and was placed against what he already held. When she stopped, he said, "The drive." "Yes." "You have it." "Yes." A pause. "Ms. Bittens, I need you to understand what you're holding." "I understand what I'm holding." "Then you understand that making a phone call to offer it to me is the moment you stopped being a witness and became a participant, legally, formally, in ways that will require." "Detective," she kept her voice at the register that closed that particular door without slamming it. "I became a participant on a road 4 nights ago when a man asked me to save his daughter. We're past the threshold conversation. Tell me what you need and tell me how fast you can move." Another pause, shorter. "Address," he said. She gave it. She ended the call. Sang-hee was looking at her from across the table. "How long?" He said 20 minutes. "He'll make it in 14. She said it without admiration, without resentment, with the flat accuracy of someone who had spent 17 years learning how men like Halloway moved through the world. Men like him always make it faster than they say. It makes them feel like they've already won something. Alyssa looked at the drive in her hand. Then she put it in her own pocket, which was a decision she made without deliberating on it and recognized, immediately afterward, as the correct one. Whatever happened in the next hour, the drive stayed with the person who had the least to lose and the most reason to stay standing. She went to the window. The SUV at the hydrant was gone. This should have been relief. The removal of a visible threat was, in every operational framework she understood, an improvement in conditions. But Alyssa stood at the window and looked at the empty hydrant space and felt the specific cold that came not from absence, but from substitution. The understanding that something had not left, but had simply changed positions. "The SUV moved," she said. Sang-hee was beside her in 3 steps. She looked at the hydrant. She looked at the street in both directions. She looked at the building across, a 6-story residential with a laundry on the ground floor, and above it, a series of windows that faced Alyssa's building with the unobstructed sightline of something useful. "3rd window, 4th floor," Sang-hee said quietly. "The curtain moved twice while we were on the phone." Alyssa looked. The curtain was still now, but still in the particular way of something recently settled. "They repositioned," Sang-hee said. "The hospital evacuation, when Bayamjun's people didn't find what they needed on that floor, they would have consolidated, triangulated." She stepped back from the window. "They know the address. They've known it. They were watching and waiting for something to change. My father's fingers moving is the thing that changed." "How many people does Bayamjun operate with?" Sang-hee's answer was not a number. It was a look, the look of someone deciding how much of an accurate answer served the current situation and how much of it would simply be a weight the other person couldn't carry productively. "Enough," she said. "But they will not move in daylight on a residential street with a police detective 14 minutes away." 14 minutes is a window. "Yes," she met Alyssa's eyes. "It is." Mrs. Perkins knocked at 9:41. Not the tentative knock of a neighbor uncertain of her welcome. The deliberate knock of a woman who had already made her decision before her hand touched the door. Alyssa opened it. Mrs. Perkins was dressed. Fully, carefully, not in her house robe but in a good dress, the kind worn to things that mattered. Behind her in the hallway were 4 other people. Mr. Ryan from 3A, who was 68 and had worked 30 years on a shipping dock, and had the particular physical solidity of someone whose body had been a professional instrument for 3 decades. His wife, a small woman named Grace who taught primary school and was currently holding, with the calm of someone who had dealt with considerably worse than this, a large thermos and an expression of focused practicality. From the 2nd floor, a young woman named Stephanie who Alyssa knew only by the sound of her sewing machine through the ceiling and the occasional exchange of mail delivered to the wrong box. She was perhaps 25, with the quiet watchfulness of someone who had arrived in this city from somewhere that had taught her the value of paying attention. And from the ground floor, bypassing Mr. Shelby entirely, Or perhaps because of Mr. Shelby, because of the phone call he had made, because the building had its own internal intelligence about what constituted a betrayal. An older man named Solomon, who ran the small alterations shop on the building's commercial ground level, and who had, in 3 years of proximity, said perhaps 40 words to Alyssa, but whose presence in this hallway now communicated everything that 40 words had left unsaid. Mrs. Perkins looked at Alyssa. "We have been talking," she said, "since last night, since the second man got in the SUV." Alyssa looked at the hallway full of people who had chosen to be here. "You don't have to," she started. "Don't," Mrs. Perkins said, not unkindly, with the firmness of someone who had anticipated this response and had decided in advance not to accept it. "You have spent 3 years in this building asking for nothing, carrying things alone that were too heavy for one person." She glanced past Alyssa's shoulder toward the back hallway. "The girl is not the first person you have tried to protect by yourself. We know that. We have eyes." The hallway was quiet. Outside, somewhere below, a car moved slowly down the street. "What we need to know," Mrs. Perkins continued, "is what you need us to do." They made a plan in 11 minutes, which was all the time available, and more than it sounded. Ryan and Solomon would take the stairwells, not to confront, not to obstruct physically, but to be present, visible, accountable witnesses in every vertical access point of the building. Men whose bodies communicated, without requiring words, that this was a building that contained people who would remember faces and could describe them in detail to the authorities who were already en route. Civilian presence as documentation. The presence of witnesses as its own form of deterrent. Grace and her thermos would go to the lobby. She would sit in the chair near the mailboxes and drink her tea and be, in every observable sense, a woman passing time in the lobby of the building where she lived. Impossible to remove without incident. Impossible to ignore. Stephanie would go to the roof access door on the top floor and do nothing except stand beside it and call Alyssa's number if it moved. Mrs. Perkins would stay on the 3rd floor landing. "In the sight line of your door," she told Alyssa, "so that whatever arrives on this floor arrives knowing it has already been seen." Alyssa looked at these people in her hallway, looked at the particular quality of their collective stillness, not bravado, not performance, not the drama of people who had decided to be heroes. The stillness of people who had calculated a risk and accepted it and were now simply executing the decision. She had seen this quality once before in 20 years, in a church basement in the city's southwest quadrant during a community meeting that had turned into something else, when a group of people who had spent years being managed by systems that didn't see them had stood up in sequence, one by one, and said, "Enough. There's a detective coming," she told them. 14 minutes, possibly less. He is not the problem. He is the resolution if we can hold the shape of this long enough for him to arrive." 14 minutes, Ryan said. He looked at his watch with the calm of a man who had spent 30 years working against deadlines measured in tonnage and tide. "That is nothing." He went to the stairwell. Sang-hee was in the kitchen when Alyssa came back inside. She had closed the laptop. She was sitting with her hands flat on the table and her eyes on the middle distance of someone running an internal calculation that the room was too small to contain. "The neighbors," she said. "They stayed. They stayed." Something crossed her face that was not quite what Alyssa had expected, not surprise, because Sang-hee was not, at her core, a person who expressed surprise, but something more fundamental. The expression of someone encountering a thing they had been told existed but had never directly witnessed. She looked at the table. She looked at her own hands. "In my father's world," she said, "people stay because of fear or because of money. Those are the 2 grammars." She paused. "What is the grammar here?" Alyssa sat across from her. "Neighborhood," she said simply. 20 years of it." The streetlight on the left side of the building made a sound. A sound streetlights did not make. A sharp, electrical report, like something overloaded, like a circuit forced beyond its rated capacity from an external source. Then the light outside Alyssa's window went dark. Then the one at the corner. Then, in the particular sequence of something systematic rather than coincidental, the 3rd light along the block. Sang-hee was already on her feet. "They're cutting the external lighting," she said. It was not a hypothesis. It was an identification. Baeomjun's people use darkness as cover when they can create it. It means they're moving now, not waiting for night. She looked at Alyssa. It means something changed their timeline. Alyssa's phone. Halloway's number on the screen, incoming. She answered. "Change of plan," Halloway said, and his voice had shifted from the measured quality of their earlier call into something compressed, functional, the voice of a man already moving. "We pulled a man from the building across your street 2 minutes ago. He had communications equipment and a directive. They know about our ETA. Someone in my department," he stopped. "The names on the drive. Some of them are mine." The sentence landed in the kitchen, with the weight of something structural failing. "How far out?" Alyssa said. 8 minutes. I have 2 units I trust coming from the south, but Ms. Bitten's, they are already in your building." She heard it then. Not the stairwell. Ryan was in the stairwell and Ryan would have called. The elevator. The building had one elevator, old and slow, that Alyssa almost never used. The sound of it arriving on a floor above, and then the particular resonance of weight moving through a structure in the specific way of people trying not to be heard, but not entirely succeeding. Roof access, Stephanie. Her phone was already ringing. Stephanie's number. She answered without speaking. "The door opened," Stephanie said, quiet, steady, the voice of someone who had been told what to do and was doing it. "2 men. They went down the interior stairs. I can see them through the door gap. They don't know I'm here." "Stay on the line," Alyssa said. "Do not move." She looked at Sang-hee. 8 minutes. 2 men inside, coming down from the roof. The people in the stairwells, in the lobby, on the landing. A detective 8 minutes out with 2 units he trusted, and a department whose integrity had just become a question mark. Sang-hee reached into her pocket and held out the USB drive. "Give me your laptop," she said. "There's something I can do in 8 minutes that makes the drive irrelevant as leverage. If it's already transmitted, there's no reason to come through that door." Alyssa looked at her. "What is your real name?" Alyssa said. Not deflection, genuine, present, the question she had been holding since the hospital room, since the closed fist, since the sharpness in the girl's eyes that had never quite matched the role she was supposed to be playing. "Not the name your father registered you under. Your real name." Sang-hee held the question for a moment, the way you held a thing you had not been asked in a very long time. "Nari," she said. "My mother named me Nari." She looked at the drive in her hand. "My father called me Sang-hee because it was safer, because Nari was the name of someone who could be found." A pause. Sang-hee was armor. Nari is what's underneath. Alyssa got the laptop from the back room. She put it on the table. "Then let's let Nari finish it," she said. Above them, on the stairs, footsteps, getting closer. And in the hallway outside, the soft, deliberate sound of Mrs. Perkins pulling her chair directly in front of Alyssa's door and sitting down in it, which was the sound of a 71-year-old woman placing herself as the first thing anyone coming down that corridor would have to account for. The streetlights were out. The building was dark in its externals. But inside, on the 3rd floor landing, a woman in a good dress sat in a chair with her hands folded in her lap, and the light from Alyssa's hallway fell through the door gap and made her visible to anyone who came. Can a social worker stop a soldier? She couldn't. She had never been trying to. She had been buying 8 minutes. The invisible ones, the ones this city drove past without noticing, the ones who processed their own emergencies quietly in apartments the infrastructure forgot, had decided that invisibility was no longer a condition they were willing to maintain. A girl named Nari was transmitting evidence that would make a 14-month case prosecutable and a 14-minute window irrelevant. A woman named Alyssa was standing in her own kitchen, which had become the most contested ground in the city, waiting for the sound that would tell her whether 8 minutes was enough. The footsteps on the stairs had stopped, which was worse than if they'd kept going. The footsteps did not resume. What resumed instead was something Alyssa registered through the building's structure rather than her ears. A vibration, distributed through the walls, the particular frequency of multiple things happening simultaneously in different parts of the same space. From below, Grace's voice in the lobby, calm and carrying, asking someone a question in a tone that required an answer. From the stairwell, Ryan's voice, lower, the voice of a man who had decided that his body in a doorframe was a sufficient argument. From the hallway, nothing, which meant Mrs. Perkins was still in her chair, which meant nobody had reached the third-floor landing yet. 4 minutes had passed since Halloway's call. Sanghi, Nari, had not looked up from the laptop since she opened it. Her fingers moved with the focused economy of someone executing a process she had prepared for in advance, which meant this was not improvisation. The transmission protocol, whatever it was, had been built before the crash, before the road, before the 4 nights in a small apartment that smelled like case files and borrowed time. This had been the plan from the beginning, or close enough to the beginning that the difference no longer mattered. "How long?" Alyssa said. "Done." She closed the laptop. The word landed without drama, without the performance of relief. Done the way you said a thing was done when the doing of it had been the only available option, and you had done it, and the future was now a different shape than it had been 60 seconds ago. She looked at Alyssa. It went to 6 addresses simultaneously, 3 journalists, a federal prosecutor's office in a city 2 states over, the international office of an organization that investigates organized crime across jurisdictions. A pause, and Halloway. "You sent it to Halloway." The file he received is time-stamped, received before anyone could claim it was altered or fabricated under duress. She said it with the precision of someone who had thought through the legal architecture of what she was building. "My father's documentation, in the original format, with metadata that traces its compilation to a device registered in his name, over a period of 14 months, which matches the length of Halloway's investigation and establishes independent corroboration." 17 years old. Alyssa looked at her and thought about the word armor, about Sanghi as armor and Nari as what was underneath, and thought that what was underneath was not soft in the way the metaphor suggested. What was underneath was something that had been being built, quietly and precisely, for longer than anyone who saw the silk dress and the Mafia princess surface had understood. "Your father knew you could do this," Alyssa said. "My father taught me to do this." She looked at the laptop. "He built the documentation. He needed someone who could transmit it in a way that couldn't be recovered or suppressed afterward. He spent 3 years teaching me the architecture for that." A pause. "He called it the last resort. He never told me the last resort would arrive on a Tuesday." From the stairwell, a sound. Different from the previous vibration, sharper, a impact, the sound of weight meeting wall, and then Ryan's voice again, this time without the composure, with the additional register that meant the conversation had changed in nature. Then Stephanie's number on Alyssa's screen. "They're in the 2nd floor corridor," Stephanie said. She was still on the roof. Her voice had not changed pitch. "Moving toward the main stairwell. 2 men, the first ones." A beat. "There's a 3rd coming up from the lobby, through the fire door, not the main entrance." 3 men. Inside. The lobby door meant they had gone around Grace, which meant Grace was still in her chair and unharmed, which meant they had decided that a woman drinking tea was a problem they could bypass rather than engage. This was tactical sense and also a relief, and also the end of the building's perimeter as a functional defense. Alyssa looked at the door. She did not reach for the pistol. This was not bravery. It was arithmetic. A social worker with a Glock 19 against 3 men who had reached their operational position by being the kind of men who handled Glocks professionally was not an equation that ended well regardless of her accuracy at the range. What she had instead of a firearm was the same thing she had always had, the thing that had gotten her further in 20 years of impossible rooms than any other tool available. The absolute, undecorated willingness to stand in a doorframe and speak the truth at a volume that required the other person to hear it. She opened her apartment door. Mrs. Perkins was in her chair on the landing. She looked at Alyssa with the expression of a woman who had heard the same sounds from the stairwell and had concluded, with 71 years of evidence to support the conclusion, that sitting down was sometimes the most powerful position available. The stairwell door opened. The man who came through it first was large in the specific way of someone whose size was professional rather than incidental. Suit jacket, dark, earpiece. The face of someone doing a job with the detachment of someone for whom the job's content was not the primary concern. Behind him, a second man, similar specification, different face. They saw Mrs. Perkins. They stopped. Not because a 71-year-old woman in a good dress was a physical obstacle. Because she was looking at them with the undisguised, absolute clarity of a witness, her eyes moving from their faces to their hands to their faces again, cataloging with the systematic attention of someone who intended to remember and had every capacity to do so. And because behind her, in the open doorway of apartment 3C, a woman in a denim jacket was standing with her phone raised, and the camera recording and a look on her face that communicated, without requiring language, that she had been in worse rooms than this and had not moved from worse doorframes than this one. The second man said something into his earpiece. The third man came from the south stairwell, the fire door end, and positioned himself at the landing's far entrance. 3 points of a triangle, Alyssa at the center. She did not lower the phone. "Everything happening in this hallway," she said, at the level she used for rooms full of people who needed to hear the same information simultaneously, "is being recorded and transmitted. Copies are going to 6 addresses as we stand here." This was partially true. The transmission had been Nari's, the content had been the drive, but the mechanism existed, and the principle held, and the men in this hallway did not need to know the granular details. "I am a city social worker. My name is documented in a phone call I made to a police detective 11 minutes ago, along with this address and the nature of the threat." She looked at the first man. "Your employer's documentation is no longer exclusively in this building, which means what happens in this hallway no longer changes the outcome it was designed to change." The first man looked at her. She looked back. The second man's earpiece produced a sound, brief, small, but audible in the landing's compressed silence. He listened. His face changed in the specific way that faces changed when an instruction was revised, when the operational directive was updated by someone above the current chain who had received new information. He looked at the first man. Something passed between them that required no words. They did not advance. The elevator arrived at the 3rd floor 4 minutes later. Alyssa heard it from inside the apartment, where she had retreated when the men in the hallway retreated, back toward the stairwells, not aggressively, with the particular reversibility of people whose reason for being in a particular place had been rendered moot. She heard the elevator's ancient mechanism. She heard the door open. She heard footsteps, different from any she had catalogued in the last 20 minutes, not the professional, operational footsteps of men executing a directive. Slower. Deliberate in a different way. The footsteps of someone managing a body that was still in the process of renegotiating its relationship with vertical movement. Mrs. Perkins' voice from the landing. Then Halloway's voice. Then a third voice, low, accented, rough in the way of a person whose vocal cords were still reacquainting themselves with the full mechanics of speech after days of silence, but present. Fully, undeniably present. Nari stood up from the kitchen table so fast her chair scraped backward across the floor. She crossed the apartment in the time it took Alyssa to register that she was moving. She hit the front door with both palms and threw it open. And stopped. Sun Disung was standing in the hallway. He was wearing a hospital gown beneath a coat that Halloway had clearly provided, because it was too long and too narrow in the shoulders for the man wearing it. And he was holding a portable oxygen monitor clipped to his finger, and he looked like a man who had been told by every medical professional within his current radius that he was not ready to be standing in a residential hallway on the 3rd floor of a building that was not a hospital. He was standing anyway. He looked at his daughter. Nari made a sound, small, involuntary, the sound of something long compressed releasing without permission. She took 1 step toward him. Then 2. Then she was across the distance of the hallway, and she was not running exactly, but she was also not walking. She was moving the way people moved when the body was done cooperating with the performance of composure. She hit him at the sternum, and his arms came around her, and the portable monitor made a brief alarmed sound that nobody in the hallway addressed, because there were more important alarms going off in more important systems. Alyssa stood in her doorway and looked at this. She thought about the road, the spinning wheels, the smoke curling into the dark, a hand flat on the asphalt, pressing into the ground to confirm it was real. Save her first. The economy of those 3 words, not save us, not save me, just the girl, just this specific human being, just the single coordinate in a complicated empire that he had not been willing to sacrifice. She thought, here is what that looks like when it works. Halloway was watching her from the far end of the landing. His face had shed the layered smile, all of it, entirely. And what was underneath was something more workable and less armored than anything he'd shown her across the threshold of her own door. He looked like a man who had revised several assessments in the last 40 minutes and was still in the process of integrating the revisions. He nodded at her, small, precise, the nod of one professional to another at the conclusion of something neither of them had fully controlled. Disung saw her over his daughter's shoulder. He had been looking for her. She understood this immediately. The way his eyes had moved across the landing when the elevator opened, the systematic quality of it, not lost or disoriented despite the days of unconsciousness, and the foreign hallway, and the body that was clearly arguing with him about every vertical inch. He had been looking for a specific face. He found it. He said something to Nari in Korean. She stepped back, not away. She kept her hand at his arm, steadying, anchoring, and turned so that he could move forward. He walked toward Alyssa's doorway with the careful, deliberate steps of a man who had decided that this particular thing was worth whatever it cost his body to accomplish it. He stopped at the threshold. He was taller than she had processed on the road. The asphalt and the blood and the urgency had compressed everything into sensation rather than detail. The tattoos were visible above the hospital gown's collar, the same density, the same intricate geography she had seen in her headlights. His face was the face of a man who had spent several days on the other side of consciousness and had returned to find the world had made decisions without him. He raised his right hand. Alyssa did not flinch, did not step back, did not do anything except look at the hand and then look at his face and let him finish the motion. He pressed his right hand flat against his chest, over his heart, and he held it there and looked at her with eyes that contained, without performance, without the diplomatic overlay of a man managing an interaction, the simple, unmediated weight of what he owed and knew he owed, and had no currency adequate to the debt. He said her name, Alyssa Bittens. He had learned it somewhere from Nari, from Halloway, from the paperwork trail she had left at the hospital. He said it with the care of someone who understood that names mattered, that the nomming of people was itself a form of seeing them. My daughter tells me you chose this. I stopped, Alyssa said. That's all. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached inside the coat, Halloway's coat, and removed an envelope. Thick, heavy in the particular way of paper that contained official things, documented things, things with signatures on them. This is not payment, he said, and the emphasis was not defensive but precise. The precision of a man who understood the distinction mattered enormously to the woman he was speaking to and had thought about how to say it correctly. What you did has no price. He held the envelope toward her. This is what my daughter asked me to make when she called me from your kitchen on the second morning, while you were sleeping. Alyssa looked at the envelope. Nari asked, he continued, that I use the remaining instruments available to me, the legal ones, the ones my lawyers control rather than my soldiers, to find what was taken from you, what the system that you work for took. He paused. She told me about the drawer, the locked one, what it contains. The photograph on the refrigerator, the yellow dress, the girl who would be 15. The envelope does not contain money, Disung said. It contains documentation of a custody modification proceeding that was filed this morning in family court, by my attorneys, on behalf of the biological parent whose parental rights were not properly terminated. His voice was careful, unhurried. I am told it is a strong filing. My attorneys are told it is the strongest case of its kind they have constructed in 20 years of family law. Alyssa's hand was on the door frame. She could feel the wood under her fingers. Solid. Present. The apartment behind her with its one working burner and its gray sheets on the daybed and the rug over the water stain. "I cannot guarantee the outcome," Disung said. "Courts are not my territory, but I am told that the circumstances of the original removal, when examined by the right people, raise questions that were not raised at the time." He looked at her. Questions that should have been raised. Alyssa took the envelope. She held it at her side and looked at this man in a borrowed coat with a heart monitor on his finger standing in her doorway. She thought about what it meant that her neighbor's daughter had found the drawer that Alyssa had kept locked for 11 years and had opened it, not with a key, but with the particular attention of someone who had been watching Alyssa closely enough to understand what the locked things were for. She thought about Nari's words at the kitchen table. "My father called me Sanghi because it was safer. Nari is what's underneath." She thought about what you called the thing underneath, a woman who had spent 20 years asking for nothing. Halloway appeared at Disung's shoulder. "We need to move. There's a federal team taking the building across the street, and I have 6 hours before the department's Internal Affairs Division starts asking questions I'd rather answer from a position of filed documentation rather than a hallway." He looked at Alyssa. "I'll need your formal statement, yours and the girls." "When?" "Tomorrow, my office, not the department's." He said it with a flatness that communicated exactly what it needed to communicate about the current state of his relationship with the department. "Bring the drive's transmission receipt. Nari tells me she sent it with a delivery confirmation that creates a time-stamped legal record." Alyssa nodded. Disung had not moved from the threshold. He was looking past her into the apartment, not searching, not assessing. Looking the way people looked at a place that had contained something they cared about. A place they wanted to hold in their mind with some accuracy. "She was safe here," he said. It was not entirely a question. "She was," Alyssa said. And then, because it was true and because he had earned the truth, she wasn't just safe, she was herself, in a way that I don't think had a lot of room in the rest of her life. Something in his face. The movement of a man receiving information that was simultaneously the best and most difficult thing he had heard. He looked at his daughter, who was standing to his left with her hand still at his arm, watching Alyssa with the expression she had been wearing since the kitchen table, the expression of someone who had, for the first time, eaten oatmeal with honey in a cramped apartment and found it sufficient. More than sufficient. They left in the elevator, Halloway and Disung and Nari. Mrs. Perkins folded her chair and carried it back to 3B. Ryan emerged from the stairwell and looked at Alyssa, and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything, because what had happened in the last 8 minutes was not the kind of thing that resolved cleanly into the language available for it. She went back inside. She stood in the kitchen with the envelope in her hands. She looked at the photograph on the refrigerator, the yellow dress, the squinting against sunlight, the laugh aimed at something outside the frame. She put the envelope on the table. She sat down. She put her hand flat on the surface, the way Disung had put his hand on the asphalt, confirming what was real. The city outside made its city sounds. The one working burner ticked as it cooled. The case files sat in their stack, waiting for her to return to them. She was still there. She was, for the first time in 11 years, not invisible to herself. A man raises his hand, and it is neither strike nor weapon, but the oldest acknowledgement one person can make to another. A girl runs not away from the life that made her, but toward the woman who showed her that underneath the armor. She had a name, and a locked drawer in a small apartment holds a story that a 17-year-old girl decided, without being asked, was worth unlocking. Alyssa Bittens has spent 20 years being nobody's first call. She is about to find out what it means to be someone's first thought. The court date was a Thursday in November. Alyssa wore the same denim jacket. This was not sentimentality. She owned 3 jackets, and the denim one was the warmest, and the courthouse was always cold in a way that suggested the building's climate control had been calibrated to keep everyone slightly uncomfortable, which in her experience was accurate to the building's broader intentions. She carried a folder, not a case file. A personal file, the first one she had ever made for herself, which contained documents she had spent the previous 6 weeks reviewing with the kind of attention she had only previously given to other people's emergencies. She sat in the hallway outside the courtroom, and she waited. This was familiar territory. Hallways, waiting, the specific fluorescent hum of institutions processing human situations through procedural frameworks. She had waited in hallways like this one more times than she could enumerate, always on behalf of someone else, always as the professional, always the person who knew the system well enough to navigate it, and not well enough to stop it from doing the thing she had brought her to stop it from doing. She had never sat in this particular hallway on behalf of herself. At 9:47, her phone vibrated. A text from a number now saved in her phone under a name that still felt strange to type. Nari. The text was 3 words and a period. We are outside. They had come, all of them. She found them in the courthouse's main atrium, Nari in clothing that was neither silk nor hospital gown, but something in between, something that looked like a person who had tried on several versions of herself and arrived at one that was honest. Mrs. Perkins in her good dress, the same one from the landing, because some occasions warranted the same dress twice. Ryan and Grace, standing together with the settled physical proximity of people who had been beside each other in difficult situations and had allowed the difficulty to become the foundation of something durable. Stephanie, who had stood beside a rooftop door for 8 minutes and had apparently decided that 8 minutes was sufficient basis for a continued investment. Solomon from the alterations shop, who said nothing, as was his established practice, but had pressed his subway card into Alyssa's hand when she passed him in the lobby that morning with a look that communicated that getting to the courthouse was not something she should have to figure out alone. She had driven anyway, but she had kept the card. Halloway was there too, in a suit that was his own this time rather than institutional armor. He was standing slightly apart from the group in the way of someone still calibrating his position within a geometry he had recently joined. He had filed his department's internal affairs documentation 3 weeks ago. He had named 6 names from the drive and had done it in the specific order that would cause the most productive cascading effect through the departmental structure. 2 of those names had resigned within a week. The remaining 4 were the subject of a federal inquiry that had, in Halloway's precise and satisfied assessment, legs. He had also, in the second week, appeared at Alyssa's door with a different quality of knock than his first visit. Less composed, more human. He had asked if she was all right in the way that people asked when they actually wanted to know and were prepared for an answer that might require something from them. She had told him she was managing. He had told her that managing was not the same thing as all right. She had told him she was aware of that. He had come back the following Tuesday with coffee. Medium, black, no sugar. The detail he had somehow acquired without her telling him. And they had sat at the kitchen table with the case files stacked to one side and talked for 2 hours about the internal affairs process and departmental corruption, and the particular ethical geography of a job that required you to operate within a system you had documented reasons not to trust. It was the most she had talked in a single sitting in 3 years. He kept coming back on Tuesdays. She had stopped being surprised by it sometime in the 3rd week, which she understood was itself a kind of arrival. The hearing lasted 40 minutes. The attorney Desung had retained was a woman named Patricia Beavers who had 23 years of family law practice, and the particular quality of courtroom presence that came from having argued cases like this one long enough to have developed a specific contempt for the paperwork errors and procedural shortcuts that had produced them. She presented the original removal documentation alongside the new assessment with the flat, precise authority of someone laying a body of evidence in front of a judge who was competent enough to read it without requiring dramatization. The original social worker's report, the one filed by the colleague, the one that had been weaponized in the custody dispute, had 3 procedural errors that should have been caught at review. Were there reviewers looking closely? They would have been. The reviewers had not been looking closely because Alyssa Bittens was a 20-year veteran whose files did not get scrutinized, which meant that the file about her had moved through the same unscrutinized channel. The judge was a woman in her 60s named Evelyn Dyer, who read both documents with the unhurried attention of someone who had long ago decided that the pace of justice was determined by the quality of attention brought to it rather than the pressure applied to it. She asked 4 questions. Attorney Beavers answered 3 of them. The 4th she directed to Alyssa. Ms. Bittens, in the intervening years, have you maintained employment and stable housing? 20 years of continuous city employment, same apartment for 3 years. Have you sought or received any mental health support during this period? She had. She had begun seeing a therapist 6 weeks ago, the week after the hallway, the week after she opened the envelope and sat at the kitchen table with her hand flat on the surface, and understood that asking for nothing was a choice she had been making rather than a condition she had been assigned. She said yes. Judge Dyer looked at the documentation for another 30 seconds. Then she looked up. The original termination proceeding contained procedural deficiencies that, under the current statutory framework, are sufficient to warrant a modification review. I am ordering an independent home assessment to be completed within 45 days, following which this court will schedule a formal reunification hearing. She looked at Alyssa over the documents. Ms. Bittens, do you understand what this means and what it does not mean? It means the door is open, Alyssa said, not that I've walked through it. The judge looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone who had heard a great many people describe their understanding of legal proceedings and was encountering, for once, an accurate one. Correct, she said. Outside the courthouse, in the November light that had the particular thin quality of a sun that was present but not committing to warmth, Nari found her on the steps. She stood beside Alyssa, and they looked at the street together for a moment. The traffic, the pedestrians, the city going about its ordinary indifference, in the manner they had established in the apartment, the manner of 2 people who had learned to occupy the same silence without requiring it to be filled. My father wants to talk to you, Nari said. When you're ready, not today. About what? The new assignment. She said it with a specificity that communicated she was quoting directly. His words. I told him he should probably find different language. He told me the language was accurate. A pause. He has been doing legal restructuring since he woke up. The attorneys have been at the house every day for 3 weeks. He is, she considered, converting the architecture of what he built into something that can be defended in daylight. Alyssa looked at her. Converting it into what? Legitimate investment, community infrastructure. Some of it was already that more than people knew. The neighborhood operations, the business fronts that were actually businesses. He wants someone who understands what the city's systems fail at and where the gaps are. Nari turned to look at her directly. Someone who has spent 20 years mapping those gaps from the inside. He wants a social worker. He wants you, she said it without deflection. Not as a, she paused. Finding the boundary of it, not in any capacity that belongs in a file anyone else can read. As a consultant, as someone who tells him where the money can go that will do what the city refuses to do for the people it refuses to see. Alyssa was quiet. She thought about 20 years of case files, about children handed off to systems that process them without seeing them, about the 3 names she had filed removal orders for whose subsequent files she had found in Halloway's investigation documentation, adjacent to Sun's syndicate recruitment records, about the gap between what institutions were designed to do and what they actually did, and what lived in that gap, and who had been living in it for long enough to know every square inch of its geography. Tell him I'll hear it, she said, not that I've agreed to it. Nari nodded. This distinction, Alyssa had learned, was one the girl honored consistently. The space between hearing and agreeing was one she had been taught to respect by a father who understood that the most important negotiations began with accurate listening. There's something else, Nari said. She reached into her coat pocket, a small object placed in Alyssa's palm, a key on a simple ring, no identifying tag. My father bought the building. Alyssa looked at the key. Your building, Nari said. He closed the transaction last week. Through one of the legal entities his attorneys restructured. She looked at the key in Alyssa's hand. The first thing he did as the building's owner was to terminate the lease of the tenant in 1A. Mr. Shelby, the phone call. The second thing, Nari continued, was to instruct the property management to complete all outstanding maintenance, including the third-floor water stain and the second-floor hallway light that has been out since before you moved in. She paused. And to replace the lobby carpet, which Mrs. Perkins has apparently been requesting since before your tenancy began. Alyssa closed her hand around the key. She thought about the rug she had bought to cover the stain. The small, self-sufficient act of making a space livable with whatever materials were available. She thought about doing that for 20 years in spaces that weren't hers to fix and coming home to do it in the one space that was. She thought about what it meant that someone had noticed the rug and understood what it signified without being told. Halloway appeared at the bottom of the courthouse steps. He had his hands in his jacket pockets, and his face had the particular open quality it had developed over the Tuesday visits. Less armored, more present, the face of a man who had started a process of removing professional distance from civilian interactions and was discovering that the distance had been structural rather than natural. "How'd it go?" he said. 45-day assessment, reunification hearing after. He nodded. "Patricia Beavers is very good." "She is." He was quiet for a moment, looked at the street. Then, "I've been offered a position, federal task force, organized crime cross-jurisdictional." He said it at the same level of flatness he used for all significant information, the flatness that was not indifference but precision, the deliberate removal of emphasis so that the information could be received without the receiver needing to account for his feelings about it simultaneously. It would use the Sun's syndicate case documentation as a founding brief, 14 months of work, and the drive's contents as the evidentiary core. "When do you have to decide?" "I was told I could name a civilian consultant, someone who understands the social infrastructure that organized crime exploits, the gap between institutional services and actual community need." He looked at her, not directly, at the middle distance that had become, over Tuesday mornings, the register of conversations that mattered enough to approach carefully. Someone who has spent 20 years inside those gaps. Alyssa looked at him. "Disung's attorney called mine this morning," he said. "They're apparently proposing a structure where the same consultant could work across both, the legitimate restructuring and the federal task force. The argument being that someone advising on where community infrastructure is needed and someone advising on where organized crime fills those needs are, operationally, looking at the same map from different angles. That's a complicated position." "It is," he paused. "You would know better than I do whether it's an impossible one." She thought about the map, the 20 years of it, the children and the case files and the gap between what existed and what was needed, and who had been operating in that gap with impunity because the people who were supposed to be looking weren't looking at the right scale. She thought about what it would mean to look at that map from both angles simultaneously, the weight of it, the precision it would require, the particular form of integrity that could not be structural or institutional, but would have to be individual, daily, chosen in the absence of any system that would enforce it. She thought, this is the assignment. Not the one Disung would describe, not the one Halloway was proposing, the one that existed at the intersection of both, the one that a woman who had spent 20 years asking for nothing and 2 decades learning where the city failed its people was specifically, irreplaceably positioned to do. "I need to think," she said. "I know." He reached into his jacket and produced a card. Different from the first one, this one had a federal office address on it, a different number, the small but legible indication of a transition already in progress. "Tuesday," he said, "whenever you're ready." She took the card. Mrs. Perkins appeared at her shoulder, Solomon at her other side, and Nari somewhere behind, and the atrium doors behind them released the rest of the people who had filled a courthouse hallway on a Thursday morning, because a woman in a denim jacket had stopped on a road at midnight and stayed. She drove home alone. Route 9, not for any reason she could name precisely, not for sentiment, not for the closure that narratives were supposed to require. She drove it because it was still a road, and she still drove roads, and the city did not reorganize its geography around significant events in individual lives. She passed the place. She knew it by the median repair, fresh asphalt, slightly darker than the surrounding surface, the city's way of acknowledging damage without acknowledging the damage's cause. The streetlights here were working, all of them, even the ones she drove past. She thought about the cracked Bible in her glove compartment, her mother's handwriting in the margins. The one who tends the wound does not ask whose blood it is. She thought the wound was mine, too. I just didn't know how to tend it. She drove. At the first light, her phone buzzed. An unknown number. She looked at it at the red light, not pulling over, not stopping, because the city moved and she moved with it. The text was 4 words. "Someone needs you, Road 7. She looked at it. She looked at the light. She looked at the road ahead, which was the same road it had always been, dark in the places the infrastructure forgot, lit in the places it remembered, imperfect and continuous, and full of the ordinary human traffic of people moving between where they were and where they needed to be. The light changed. Alyssa Bittens put her foot on the accelerator. She did not check the time. She did not calculate the distance. She did not perform the arithmetic of risk versus outcome that a rational person was supposed to perform before driving toward an unknown, numbers instruction on a road she'd never taken. She drove. Because 20 years had built something in her that was not naivety and not recklessness, and not even the particular self-neglect that had once been her deepest flaw, the belief that her own life had no weight worth preserving. What it had built was simpler and more durable than any of those things. It had built the knowledge that the road always chose correctly, and that the only thing worse than being in danger was being the person who looked away. She is no longer invisible. She is no longer alone. She is no longer the woman who waits for the bus that never comes. She is something the city doesn't have a file for, a woman who has been blood bonded to a Korean Mafia boss's daughter, partnered with a federal detective, trusted by a floor full of neighbors who chose to be seen when it mattered, and is now driving toward a road she has never taken at a speed that suggests she has already decided. Alyssa Bittens asked for nothing for 20 years. The road gave her everything anyway. Some people become heroes loudly, in ways the city records. Alyssa became one quietly, the way she did everything in the margins, in the dark. Between the paperwork and the fluorescent lights and the plastic chairs, in the space where the system ended and the human being began. That space is where she has always lived. It turns out it was never a margin. It was the whole story.